in this new story. Archived winter investigation files from 3 different counties describe a particular stretch of mountain highway where whiteouts reportedly form faster than radio towers can update alerts. The phenomenon repeats every December. It isn't marked on public maps, authorities never officially classify it as hazardous, yet everyone living within 50 miles knows exactly which section it is. Locals simply call it the Ridge, travelers call it cursed, and truckers who use the road at night learn quickly that you cannot outrun a whiteout there because the storms behave like something alive. Lennox Rourke, a 37-year-old contracted supply driver, drove that highway on a mid-December evening under a sky that looked too still for winter. The air felt heavy rather than cold, the kind of pressure that builds before storms gather but hides long enough to trick forecasters. He finished loading equipment crates onto the bed of his truck, tightened the straps twice, then checked his chains, flare kit, first aid bag, and the battery in his handheld radio. He kept a heavy thermos of coffee beside him, a habit formed after 20 winters spent hauling supplies into the mountains. He left the last outpost before dusk, following the 2-lane highway into a narrow canyon where wind usually howled through rock cuts. That night, the canyon remained silent. Not a single gust, not a single shifting branch. He watched his breath curl in the cab and felt the strange stillness press against the windows like a held breath. Snow lingered in small flurries that drifted in lazy spirals. The clouds above the ridge formed long, undisturbed sheets that glowed faintly in the fading light. 10 miles up, he noticed a pair of fresh tire tracks on the snow-coated pavement. They belonged to a smaller vehicle, likely a compact sedan judging by the width. The tracks wobbled toward the outer shoulder several times before correcting. Whoever drove ahead wasn't confident on the ice. Lennox radioed a routine position update, received static instead of a response, and slowed his speed as he approached a long curve that overlooked a steep ravine. Through his headlights, he saw the parked sedan. Its hazard lights blinked weakly. Snow piled against the bumper. The driver door hung open. He pulled behind it and stepped out into a sudden gust that didn't match the earlier calm. Snow stung his cheeks. The seat inside the sedan held a thin layer of frost, as if the driver abandoned it recently. A half-written note lay on the passenger floor. It described disorientation, a strange pulsing glare over the ridge, and worsening visibility ahead. The scrawled handwriting ended mid-sentence in a long, jagged mark. Footprints led into the dense timberline, then vanished abruptly where the wind swept through the trees. Lennox called out, but only swirling snow answered. He checked the trunk and glove compartment, confirming no luggage or wallet remained. It looked like the driver fled in a panic. He radioed dispatch again, but the signal cut in and out, the interference sharp and pulsing in sync with unseen static. He continued up the highway because the research lodge needed its supplies before temperatures dropped overnight. Snow deepened quickly. He flicked on the high beams and leaned forward as he climbed another 1,000 feet of elevation. The wind returned with sudden force, carrying sheets of white across the pavement. The whiteout formed instantly. In less than a second, his world turned to blinding white. His beams reflected back into his cab like a wall of light. The road disappeared beneath swirling frost. He slowed to a crawl, searching for the faint yellow line beneath the snow. The truck groaned as the wind shoved at its side. Then he felt it, a deep, rolling vibration beneath the pavement. It rumbled through the steering column and into his arms. At first, he thought he drove over cracked asphalt, but the vibration repeated in a pattern far too regular to be natural. It felt like machinery working under the road, pulsing in slow waves. A hollow hum filled the cab, not a noise from the engine, but something distant traveling through the ground. He gripped the wheel tighter and whispered to himself that he only needed to reach the next turnout. But the storm had erased every landmark. His radio crackled violently before going silent. Even emergency frequencies fell into total static. Through the swirling white, he saw a faint glow, dim and warm like a lantern or flare. It pulsed twice, then faded. The storm swallowed it whole. He finally spotted the turnout sign half buried under wind-shaped drifts. He turned into it and killed the engine. The moment the truck stilled, the world fell silent, except for the soft hiss of snow against the windows. The vibration beneath the ground returned, stronger this time. He stepped out and instantly felt the storm slam him sideways. Snow whipped across his vision in chaotic bursts. Still, he saw it again, the distant lantern-like glow flickering far down the ridge, swaying as if carried by an unsteady hand. He raised his flashlight and followed the glow. Each step sank past his ankles. The wind roared so loudly he barely heard his breathing. The lantern glow brightened, then dimmed. When he reached the ridge edge, the wind paused, just briefly, revealing a trail of fresh footprints descending into a narrow gap between two boulders. He followed the prints to a sheltered clearing, where the wind died completely. There, he found a metal service box half buried in ice. Its door hung open, clinking softly in the breeze. Inside, a flickering emergency lamp illuminated piles of old engineering logs scattered across the snow. He brushed frost off one page and read that decades ago, crews tried stabilizing the ridge after discovering deep fractures extending several miles beneath the highway. Some fractures reportedly produced heavy vibrations during cold snaps, others echoed with humming noises long after construction equipment shut down. One engineer wrote that whiteouts triggered surface shifts powerful enough to knock tools off tables. Another recorded flashes of color during storms that turned the snow blue for a moment before fading. None of the entries ended optimistically. The project halted after a series of unexplained injuries. The final pages contained abrupt, shaky handwriting as if recorded in haste before crews evacuated the area. The wind returned violently, slamming the service box door against its hinge. Snow blasted across the clearing, burying the footprints behind Lennox in seconds. He attempted to climb back to the turnout, but the storm collapsed around him. The whiteout erased all shape, all direction, all sense of slope. The vibration beneath the ground grew into a steady pulse. He dropped one knee into the drift, bracing himself. Then the light appeared again, this time brighter, bluish, and closer. It flashed once, then again. It illuminated the storm like lightning flickering inside a closed room. He shielded his face as the vibration stopped abruptly, leaving a deep ringing in his ears. When the storm eased momentarily, he recognized the outline of his truck barely 30 yards uphill. He pushed through the drifts and climbed into the cab with shaking hands. His headlights flickered. The dashboard lights dimmed. And then something struck the back of the truck. Not a rock, not debris, something heavy enough to shift the entire chassis. He looked through the rear window but saw only churning white. When the dash lights returned, he noticed new tracks behind his vehicle footprints moving in a staggering, uneven pattern. They circled the back of the truck twice before stopping abruptly at an untouched drift. No exit trail. No continuation. Just sudden absence. The radio crackled violently. A voice broke through for half a second, a woman screaming a word he couldn't understand. The signal collapsed again before the dispatcher came through, faintly asking for his status. Lennox forced his voice steady as he reported everything he'd seen. She ordered him to return immediately. The descent felt endless. Whiteout pockets still erupted at random, swallowing the world in sudden blindness before releasing it again. Snow reflected his taillights in ghostly red bursts. The mountain behind him pulsed with silent flashes he could not explain. Only when he reached the lower forest line did the storm finally weaken. Search teams reached the abandoned sedan the next morning. The seat still held a thin layer of frost. The driver never returned. No prints remained except deep indentations captured in early photographs. A team located the service box clearing and retrieved the logs, confirming chronic seismic anomalies beneath that stretch of highway. Several log entries matched the timing of Lennox's report almost exactly. But the most disturbing discovery came from the audio files engineers recovered from Lennox's malfunctioning radio. Buried beneath the static, analysts detected irregular pulses matching the tremor pattern of underground shifts too deep and too rhythmic to be caused by ordinary geological movement. Locals still warn travelers never to trust the ridge's calm skies. They say the whiteouts there do not behave like normal storms. They arrive instantly. They vanish instantly. And sometimes, during the brightest flashes, they reveal silhouettes of things standing where no person could stand. Some claim to hear humming beneath the tires just before the visibility collapses. Others swear the snow glows blue right before the tremors begin. Lennox refuses to drive that highway now. He told investigators he can still feel the vibration in his bones when he thinks about the storm. And he still dreams about the footprints appearing behind his truck, circling twice before ending nowhere, as if something walked there only long enough to watch him through the snow. He knows one thing for certain. On that mountain highway, you cannot outrun a whiteout. Not because it moves fast, but because it feels like the storm is already waiting for you the moment you decide to climb the ridge. And once the wind closes, there is no direction, only white, only echoes, and only the sense that something beneath the road finally woke up. In this new story, archived winter maintenance logs mention an old steel bridge on a remote state route where severe icing and unexplained stallouts reportedly occur each year. Officials list the bridge as structurally sound, yet the pattern repeats every December and January. Locals warn travelers to avoid crossing it after dark because storms form quickly along the river valley, and visibility often collapses without warning. Several incidents ended with vehicles found empty, engines still warm, doors locked or left swinging open in icy wind. Marin Calloway, a 34-year-old environmental field sampler, approached that bridge during an early January afternoon while returning from a downstream water quality site. She expected a routine drive since snowfall remained light and her schedule only required one more sample reading before she reached town. She drove a sturdy four-wheel truck with insulated gear, a portable radio, and laminated route maps. Even with preparation, she disliked that bridge because the steel trusses groaned in cold weather and the deck froze faster than surrounding pavement. The sky carried a muted gray color as she climbed the winding route toward the river valley. Tall pines leaned inward across the shoulder, while thin clouds dragged along the ridgetops. The temperature dropped several degrees as she descended toward the bridge. Ahead, she noticed faint tire tracks veering near the guardrail before straightening again. She slowed instinctively since the state's winter bulletin mentioned 2 minor spinouts in the area earlier that week. When she reached the approach, she saw an empty sedan parked crookedly near the midpoint. Its hazard lights blinked steadily through drifting snow. She pulled over before stepping out to check for the driver. A strong crosswind pushed at her coat, while the steel beams above her produced a low groan. The sedan's driver door stood slightly ajar, yet no footprints led away from it. Snow should have covered them quickly, but even shallow indentations would remain visible under the slow-falling flakes. She called hello several times, but heard nothing except the river rumbling below under layers of ice. She checked the sedan interior where the key remained in the ignition, and the dashboard still glowed faintly. A small notebook lay open on the passenger seat, with scribbles mentioning a vibration felt halfway across the span. The writing ended abruptly near the words "freezing up." The pages showed no signs of wet snow, which meant the driver likely wrote it minutes before abandoning the car. Marin recorded the license plate and noted the coordinates before heading back to her truck. The wind intensified as she approached the midpoint of the bridge. The steel trusses groaned a second time with a deeper tone. She slowed to listen and felt a faint vibration travel through the pavement into her boots. She stepped toward the guardrail and leaned over. Chunks of ice floated beneath winding currents, but the water remained mostly frozen. The vibration pulsed again like something thudding far beneath the surface. She stepped back toward her truck while the wind grew harsher. Marin radioed dispatch to report the abandoned vehicle, but the signal crackled heavily. Static filled the line, followed by fragmented syllables. She repeated her message and received no clear reply. Storm fronts often disrupted valley reception, yet this distortion sounded more mechanical than atmospheric. She logged the attempted call and returned to her truck, intending to cross quickly before conditions worsened. Halfway across, she felt the steering wheel jitter lightly. The vibration returned through the frame. Snow blew in shifting curtains that obscured her view of the opposite shore. The vibration grew into a steady thrum, not strong enough to shake the truck, yet impossible to ignore. She slowed to a crawl. Her headlights cut through swirling flakes and revealed a faint glow near the far guardrail. The glow flickered, dimmed, then grew slightly brighter. She braked softly and leaned forward. The glow seemed to originate near the deck surface. She stepped out of the truck cautiously while keeping the door open. The wind cut at her cheeks. She approached the guardrail and shone her flashlight downward. The beam reflected against thick ice, but a faint shimmering line pulsed beneath the surface. It moved slowly, traveling parallel to the bridge, as if following the riverbed. The pulse dimmed, then strengthened again. Marin backed away quickly. The vibration synced with the shimmering pulse, which made the steel beneath her boots tremble faintly. She reached for her truck door when a deep crack echoed from underneath the structure. The sound reverberated through the trusses like metal bending under pressure. She froze for 2 seconds before climbing back into the truck and slamming the door. She pressed the accelerator gently. The wheels spun on ice before gripping. Snow intensified into a sudden, dense sheet that reduced visibility to almost nothing. She kept her truck centered on the faint raised reflectors along the deck until she reached the opposite end. As she climbed uphill toward the turnout beyond the bridge, she noticed a shape standing near the maintenance shed. Her headlights flashed across the figure, which appeared motionless, bundled in heavy winter gear. She slowed and rolled down her window slightly. "Do you need help?" she called. The figure did not respond. When her headlights angled downward during the next dip in the road, she realized the figure was actually an empty parka mounted on a bent steel pole. The wind pushed the parka slightly, which made it appear as if it shifted earlier. A tag pinned to the collar read, "Watch the ice line." She had never seen maintenance crews mark hazards this way. She parked near the shed and inspected the pole. The snow around it showed old indentations, but no recent footprints. Inside the shed, she found an outdated maintenance log containing entries from more than a decade earlier. One page mentioned crews hearing low-frequency tremors during extreme cold spells. Another described sudden frost forming inside the shed even when heaters ran. Toward the end of the log, a note stated that bright pulses appeared beneath the ice during storms, yet no cracks were found in the bridge's support piers. The final entry ended with a reference to ice lines shifting upstream anytime temperatures dropped sharply. Wind slammed the shed door and extinguished her flashlight for a moment. She stepped outside but found the air unnervingly still. Snowflakes drifted downward in silence. The river should have produced noise, yet for a few seconds everything felt muted. A faint clicking sound broke the stillness. It came from the underside of the bridge, a slow metallic pattern repeated 3 times before fading. Marin radioed dispatch again from the turnout. This time, the signal passed through cleanly. She reported the abandoned sedan and unusual vibrations. The operator confirmed they already received partial reports of a missing driver earlier that afternoon. A unit would arrive within an hour, but warned her not to return to the bridge until the storm weakened. She waited in her truck until wind pressure shifted enough to force snow sideways. She watched the bridge through the windshield. The shimmering pulse beneath the ice appeared again, brighter this time. It ran along the length of the river as if moving upstream. The steel trusses shivered lightly, which made her grip the steering wheel unconsciously. She could not tell whether the vibration came from the ice or the structure itself. When the rescue unit finally reached the area, they located the sedan, but found no tracks leading away from it. They reported the same vibration and noted that sections of the ice beneath the span reflected their searchlights strangely. Marin gave them her notes and continued toward town with caution. Snow thickened again behind her as she drove along the ridge overlooking the river. Authorities inspected the bridge thoroughly the next day. They found no structural damage, no cracked piers, and no mechanical cause for the vibration. They confirmed mild seismic activity occurred during the storm, but classified it as normal for deep winter temperature shifts. The missing driver's notebook remained the only clue, though no one could explain the abrupt ending in the final entry. Engineers attempted to recreate the shimmering pulse by shining lights beneath the ice during later inspections, but found nothing. Local fishermen, however, claimed to see faint lines of light drifting under certain stretches of the frozen river during extreme cold. Some believed trapped algae layers caused the effect. Others said the riverbed housed decades-old drainage conduits that funneled air pockets in odd patterns. None of these explanations matched the rhythmic vibration reported for years. Residents warned travelers again as January progressed. They said the bridge changed personality during deep freezes. Cars stalled inexplicably, even with full fuel tanks. People heard tapping beneath the deck when wind pressure increased. Sometimes faint footprints appeared on the bridge at dawn, despite fresh, untouched snow before and after the prince. Marin avoided the route for weeks after her encounter. She later reviewed the maintenance log she photographed at the shed and noticed a line she missed earlier. One entry mentioned that ice shifted as if pulled from beneath the river during certain nights. The writer also noted that steel beams resonated like tuning forks when the pulses passed under the span. Each winter, the same phenomena return. Drivers report sudden fog banks forming above the deck. Some describe a faint glow beneath the ice moving against the current. Others mention headlights flickering when crossing the midpoint. No conclusive evidence explains the cause. Yet every January, the maintenance crew marks the bridge with new salt barrels, fresh cones, and handwritten warnings on orange boards. As temperatures drop and storms rebuild across the mountains, the frozen bridge begins to groan again. The vibration returns in slow, deliberate waves. And travelers crossing at night sometimes swear they feel the entire river shift beneath them, as if something deep below follows the lines of ice, waiting for the coldest moment to rise toward the surface. Why this bridge is monitored every winter. The massive suspension bridge spanning the narrow canyon of the Iron River remained a silent witness to the brutal winters of the Northern Range for over 60 years. A single automated structural sensor sat perched atop a weathered steel girder near the remote boundary of the central support tower. This specific device was programmed to take a high-resolution photograph every 60 seconds to monitor the dangerous buildup of ice and snow on the suspension cables. Local maintenance officials rarely checked the digital archives unless a significant tremor or a major blizzard was reported in the area. On a Tuesday in December of 2022, the camera recorded a sequence of images that seemed entirely ordinary to any casual observer. Caleb Vance was a 42-year-old structural technician who worked for the Regional Bridge Authority during that busy year. His primary job involved traveling to remote locations to ensure that solar panels and data transmitters were functioning within normal parameters. Caleb enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the rugged landscape far from the city noise. He was a man of meticulous detail who could spot a hairline fracture in 1,000 square feet of reinforced steel. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific camera unit was experiencing a strange recurring storage error. He packed his tools into his white utility truck and began the long drive toward the isolated canyon crossing. The drive took nearly 3 hours, and the fog hung low over the dense canopy of ancient cedar and fir trees. Caleb reached the base of the tower and connected his rugged laptop to the diagnostic port located inside the metal box. He noticed that the hard drive was almost full of temporary files that should have been deleted automatically every month. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of photographs taken during a recent heavy ice storm. Caleb decided to download the final batch of images before he cleared the memory and reset the internal software of the camera. He wanted to make sure the optical sensor had not been damaged by the freezing rain or the high winds. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the thumbnails to ensure the lens was still properly focused. He saw the familiar gray cables and the blurred shapes of passing cars that moved through the frame at high speeds. One image from 3 nights prior caught his eye because the background lighting looked different from the photos around it. A dark maintenance van was parked on the narrow shoulder of the bridge just past the edge of the pedestrian walkway. The van had its hazard lights on, and the rear cargo door was left standing wide open toward the deep canyon below. It was an odd place to stop because the bridge was cleared of all work crews during the winter months. Caleb felt a slight chill because that section of the river crossing was known for having absolutely no cellular phone service coverage. He clicked on the next photo in the sequence to see if a worker was standing near the vehicle for help. The dark van was still there, but the open door was now closed and a dark figure stood near the edge. The figure appeared to be reaching over the metal railing, and they were pulling something heavy out from the deep shadows. Caleb zoomed in on the grainy pixels until he could see the silhouette of a large and dusty industrial trunk. The person in the photo was wearing a heavy insulated parka that obscured their identity from the camera lens. He checked the timestamps and realized that the person had been at that specific location for less than 5 minutes total. The third photo showed the dark van pulling back onto the asphalt and leaving nothing but tire tracks in the slush. Caleb looked toward the actual spot on the shoulder and saw that the snow was still flattened near the railing. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished. He stepped over the safety barrier and walked toward the exact place where the figure had stood in the photograph. The air was freezing, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the massive steel cables. The ground was slick from the recent ice, and he noticed deep grooves in the frost where something heavy had been dragged. He followed the trail for about 20 feet until he reached a small maintenance access hatch hidden behind a thicket of support beams. Caleb found the industrial trunk tucked under a pile of damp tarpaulins and heavy coils of wire that looked intentionally placed. He reached down to touch the cold metal surface and saw that the heavy latches were sealed with industrial duct tape. A faint smell of metallic decay hung in the stagnant air, and Caleb immediately pulled his hand back in sudden realization. He knew that he should not open the container without the proper law enforcement authorities present at the scene. He used his satellite radio to contact the dispatch office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious item on the bridge. Within an hour, 2 state troopers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with yellow plastic tape. They asked Caleb to show them the photographs on his laptop so they could identify the make and the model of the van. The officers noted that the vehicle did not have a visible rear license plate in any of the captured frames. They carefully cut the tape on the trunk and discovered several stolen historical artifacts from a local museum storage facility. These were items that had been missing for months following a quiet break-in that left no physical evidence. The museum had reported a quiet break-in 3 months earlier, but the investigators had no leads on the missing items. These artifacts were extremely valuable, and the thieves had likely hidden them on the bridge until the search died down. The police realized the driver must have returned to the crossing to move the cache to a more permanent location. They analyzed the bridge camera data from other units along the highway to track the path of the dark van. This lead eventually took them to a small rental property located 2 towns over from the edge of the canyon. They found the vehicle hidden in a detached garage behind a row of tall hedges and old weeds. Inside the house, the authorities found more items that had been taken during the same heist earlier that same year. The suspects had been living there under false names while they waited for a buyer to finalize a secret overseas purchase. One of the men was a former bridge inspector who knew exactly how to avoid the primary security monitoring systems. He did not realize that the remote structural camera was set to trigger every minute, regardless of any motion detection. His simple mistake of parking in that specific spot had provided the only evidence needed to solve the entire case. The archives of the Bridge Authority had captured the one moment he thought was completely private. Caleb returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details. Most people would have deleted the corrupted files without looking at the images because it was a routine maintenance job. The Iron River Bridge was now safe from the looters, and the historical treasures were returned to their rightful display cases. He continued his work across the mountains and always looked a little closer at the photos from the lonely spans. Sometimes the most important things are hidden in the background of a world that is always moving too fast. The quiet technician had become an accidental hero by simply doing his job with a very watchful eye. The automated camera still stands on its steel girder and records the passage of time 1 frame at a time. It captures the fog and the ice and the occasional car that travels through the silence of the deep canyon. No one ever suspects that a simple machine could be the most important witness to a crime in the wilderness. Caleb knows that every photograph tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to look for it. He drives the highway with a new perspective and watches the shadows for anything else the lens might have caught. The bridge remains vast and mysterious, but it is no longer a place where secrets can stay hidden forever. The federal investigation into the museum theft revealed that the suspects had intended to smuggle the artifacts across the border. This operation would have stripped the region of its cultural history and compromised the integrity of the local museum archives. The recovery of the original artifacts ensured that several ongoing historical research projects could be settled with accurate evidence. Caleb received a formal commendation from the state governor for his role in preserving the heritage of the entire mountain community. He often shares the story of the bridge camera with new technicians as a lesson in professional diligence. The structural logs are now fully digitized, but the physical history remains protected by the sensors and the heavy steel beams. The quiet bridge stands over the river and continues to serve the travelers as it has for many decades. Visitors admire the architecture and the views of the canyon without knowing the secret that was hidden deep beneath the walkway. The story of the structural sensor and the industrial trunk has become a local legend among the mountain residents. Most people walk past the steel tower without realizing its significance in the history of the regional highway. For Caleb, the sound of the wind against the cables will always be a reminder of the hidden truths in the cold. The record of the world continues to grow one frame at a time for anyone who cares to look. The truth about what happened on that Tuesday in December remains locked away in boxes of redacted paperwork and police files. The people of the mountain valley continue their lives while the mystery of the bridge camera hangs over the canyon. It is a reminder that some things are captured by the machines that are never meant to be understood by humans. Caleb continues to keep his watch from a distance, knowing that the sensors will eventually trigger another silent alarm. The silence of the bridge is never truly empty when the sensors are the only ones left to listen. The story of the Iron River is written in the steel and preserved in the digital logs. The Bridge Authority implemented new security protocols to review all storage errors manually to prevent similar incidents from going unnoticed. Caleb is often cited in training sessions as the primary example of a technician who performed his duty with excellence. The highway continues to wind through the pines, and the camera continues to click in the silence of the night. Every minute, a new frame is added to the digital history of the Northern Corridor for the safety of all travelers. The record of the world grows steadily as the machines watch over the lonely places where humans rarely venture alone. Caleb knows that the truth is always there, waiting to be found by someone with the patience to look. The mystery of the canyon bridge is solved, but the watch over the mountain highway will never truly come to an end. The silence of the pines is now filled with the knowledge that the past is finally safe and secure. Technicians now take a little more time to review the archives before they clear out the temporary storage on site. They look for the parked vans and the open doors and the figures moving through the shadows in the dark. The mountains keep many secrets, but they are becoming harder to hide from the ever-watchful digital eyes of the sensors. Caleb takes a final look at his laptop screen before he packs up his gear and heads back to the city. Everything is as it should be, and the system is functioning perfectly once again for the next 30 days of winter. He starts his truck and begins the long descent toward the valley while the mountain peaks fade in the mirror. The bridge is a lonely path through the wilderness, but it is no longer a place of hidden crimes and secrets. Every minute, a small click echoes from the top of the steel tower as a new image is captured. The record of the world continues to grow one frame at a time for anyone who cares to look. The story of the bridge is over, but the watch over the canyon will never truly end. The missing tape found inside an abandoned ranger station. In the late summer of 1984, a local hiking group discovered a small cabin hidden deep within the woods. The structure served as an old ranger station that the forestry department had officially decommissioned over 30 years before that day. Inside the dusty main room, they found a single magnetic tape sitting on a desk next to an empty lantern. The reel was thick with grime and appeared to have been untouched since the mid-20th century was still in its prime. Silas Vance was a 32-year-old land surveyor who spent most of his weeks mapping the rugged terrain. He arrived at the trailhead early on a Tuesday morning with the simple goal of marking the western boundary lines. The weather was unusually clear for that time of year, and Silas expected to finish his work before the sunset. He carried a heavy pack filled with surveying tools and a large thermos of coffee to keep his energy levels high. The forest was quiet and the air felt heavy with the scent of damp pine needles and ancient decaying wood. As Silas pushed through a dense thicket of pine trees, he stumbled upon the rotted remains of a wooden fence. He followed the timber line until he saw the silhouette of a small building perched on a rocky limestone ledge. The windows were boarded up with gray planks, and the front door hung slightly open on its rusted iron hinges. Silas stepped onto the porch and felt the floorboards groan under his weight as he moved toward the dark interior. He noticed that the structural integrity of the cabin was failing as the roof sagged under the weight of moss. He pushed the door open and noticed a strange scent of old paper and copper hanging heavy in the air. A thick layer of dust covered every surface, but the desk in the center of the room looked surprisingly clean. Silas approached the desk and saw a reel-to-reel tape recorder sitting ready as if someone just stepped away. He found a small black cassette tape resting beside the machine with a handwritten label that simply said August 4th. The handwriting was cramped and looked as though it had been written by a hand that was shaking with fear. According to local archives, the last ranger assigned to this specific station was a man named Elias Thorne in 1950. Dispatch logs from that year indicate that Elias stopped responding to his weekly radio check-ins without any prior warning. Search teams combed the surrounding hills for several weeks, but never found a trace of the missing Forest Service employee. Silas picked up the tape and realized it was the only piece of modern equipment left in the entire building. He felt a cold sensation in his chest as he wondered what had truly happened to the man named Elias. The surveyor decided to bring the tape back to his office to see if the recorded audio contained any clues. He spent the next 3 hours hiking back to his truck while the sun began to dip below the horizon. Silas felt a strange sense of urgency to hear the voice of the man who had vanished so long ago. He drove home in silence and immediately began searching for a compatible player to listen to the old magnetic reel. The town was quiet as he passed through the main street and noticed the flickering lights of the old theater. Silas eventually found a working player at a local thrift store and connected it to his desk speakers that evening. He pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of static, followed by the sound of a heavy door closing. A voice that sounded tired and strained began to speak about a series of lights appearing in the northern valley. The man on the recording claimed that the lights were moving in patterns that did not match any known aircraft. He spoke with a level of detail that suggested he was an experienced observer of the natural mountain world. The narrator described how the lights would hover over the tree line for hours before disappearing into the deep mountain lakes. Witness statements from 1950 mentioned similar sightings by residents in the nearby town of Oakhaven during that same summer. Elias Thorne reported that he had started hearing a low humming sound coming from the floorboards of the station. He believed that something was living beneath the cabin and was using the radio antenna to broadcast a strange signal. The humming was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass jars on the shelves to vibrate and crack. Silas listened closely as the recording captured the sound of rhythmic tapping against the exterior walls of the ranger station. Elias stopped speaking for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the heavy breathing of a man. The ranger whispered that he could see eyes reflecting the moonlight through the gaps in the wooden boards of the door. He claimed that the visitors were not from the town, and they did not look like any animals he knew. The tapping was persistent and moved from the walls up to the shingles on the roof with great speed. The investigation into the disappearance of Elias Thorne had originally concluded that he likely suffered from isolation and wandered off. However, the details on the tape suggested that the ranger was documenting a very specific and physical threat to his safety. Silas paused the audio and looked at the date on the tape, which was the day before Elias went missing. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the tapping on the recording was getting much louder. The sound was sharp and sounded like metal striking against the ancient wood of the isolated mountain station. The final few minutes of the audio contained a frantic description of the cabin being surrounded by a bright blue light. Elias shouted that the humming sound was vibrating the glass in the windows and making his ears bleed from the pressure. He mentioned that he was going to hide the tape in the desk and hoped that someone would eventually find it. The recording ended abruptly with a loud metallic crash and the sound of the wind rushing through the open station. Silence filled the room of Silas as the tape continued to spin without any more recorded sound or voices. Silas contacted the local historical society the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the abandoned woods. A researcher named Marcus Reed examined the tape and confirmed that the voice matched the old radio logs of Elias Thorne. They returned to the site of the ranger station together to look for the hidden compartment Elias mentioned on the tape. The forest seemed different under the morning light, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their minds. They found a small metal box buried under the floorboards that contained a series of photographs and a silver ring. The photographs showed blurry images of metallic objects hovering over the very trees Silas had walked through just the day before. One image captured a tall figure standing in the shadows of the porch with elongated limbs and very large dark eyes. Marcus noted that the silver ring had strange symbols etched into the band that did not belong to any language. They realized that Elias Thorne had not simply disappeared, but had been documenting an encounter that defies any logical explanation. The symbols on the ring seemed to glow faintly when the men brought it into the direct sunlight. The authorities reopened the case, but the physical evidence remained the only proof of what happened on that August night. Silas often thinks about the quiet ranger station and the man who spent his final hours recording a warning for others. The tape serves as a haunting reminder that some mysteries are buried in the woods for a very good reason. He no longer surveys that section of the forest because the low humming sound still echoes in his quiet dreams. The station remains empty and forgotten by most, but the tape still holds the secrets of 1950. Every time Silas looks at the jagged peaks of the mountains, he remembers the frantic voice of the lost forest ranger. He kept a copy of the tape in a safe place, but he rarely has the courage to play the audio. The researcher, Marcus Reed, moved away shortly after the investigation ended, and he never spoke of the silver ring again. Local legends continue to grow about the station on the limestone ledge and the lights that still appear in the valley. Silas knows that the truth is recorded on that thin magnetic strip hidden inside the drawer of his wooden desk. The secret behind an unmarked highway pull-off. The existence of unmarked highway pull-offs often suggests a forgotten history or a utility access point that the public was never meant to use. A local road maintenance crew found a hidden gravel path tucked behind a dense row of overgrown hedges near the interstate exit last spring. The entrance was intentionally obscured by heavy timber and a rusted gate that appeared to have been locked for over 40 years without being disturbed. It led to a small concrete bunker that sat perfectly level with the surrounding forest floor and was completely invisible from the main road above. Silas Vance was a 38-year-old civil engineer who spent his career inspecting the structural integrity of old mountain infrastructure. He arrived at the highway mile marker early on a Tuesday morning with the simple goal of assessing the drainage pipes for the county. The weather was unusually humid for that time of year, and Silas expected to finish his survey before the heavy afternoon rain began to fall. He carried a professional surveying kit and a high-powered flashlight to navigate the dark and damp spaces beneath the elevated roadway. The forest was thick, and the air felt heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and ancient limestone dust that never quite settled. As Silas pushed through a dense thicket of blackberry brambles, he stumbled upon the rotted remains of a heavy steel chain. He followed the path of the rusted metal until he saw the silhouette of a heavy iron door set into the side of a hill. The frame was reinforced with thick concrete, and the handle was seized shut by decades of exposure to the mountain moisture and cold. Silas stepped onto the concrete pad and felt the ground vibrate slightly as a heavy truck passed on the highway high above his head. He noticed that the seal around the door was still airtight and the industrial paint had not chipped despite the passage of time. He pushed the door with all his weight and noticed a strange scent of ozone and hydraulic fluid hanging heavy in the air inside. A thick layer of white frost covered the walls and every surface, but the control panels in the center of the room looked brand new. Silas approached the console and saw a series of analog gauges sitting ready as if someone had just finished a shift at the station. He found a small leather logbook resting beside the monitor with a handwritten label that simply said Project Deep Reach. The handwriting was cramped and looked as though it had been written by a person who was working under extreme mental or physical stress. According to local archives, the last technician assigned to this specific underground facility was a man named Elias Thorne in 1972. Dispatch logs from that year indicate that Elias stopped responding to his daily status reports without any prior warning or explanation to his superiors. Search teams combed the surrounding woods for several weeks, but never found a trace of the missing government contractor or his personal vehicle. Silas picked up the logbook and realized it was the only piece of documentation left in the entire cold and silent room. He felt a cold sensation in his chest as he wondered what had truly happened to the man who worked alone in the dark. The engineer decided to bring the logbook back to his field office to see if the written entries contained any clues about the facility. He spent the next 3 hours hiking back to his truck while the sun began to dip below the horizon of the mountains. Silas felt a strange sense of urgency to read the words of the man who had vanished so long ago from the pull-off. He drove home in silence and immediately began searching for any historical context regarding the secret construction projects of the 1970s era. The town was quiet as he passed through the main street and noticed the flickering streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement of the road. Silas eventually found a magnifying glass in his desk drawer and began to read the first entry by the light of his lamp. He turned the page and heard the sound of the wind rattling the glass of his office window as he focused on the text. A voice in his head seemed to form as he read about a series of vibrations appearing in the lower bedrock of the valley. The man in the logbook claimed that the vibrations were moving in patterns that did not match any known seismic activity or mining work. He wrote with a level of detail that suggested he was an experienced geologist who was familiar with the deep crust of the earth. The narrator described how the vibrations would intensify for hours before disappearing into the deep aquifers that ran beneath the local mountain range. Witness statements from 1972 mention similar low-frequency noises being heard by residents in the nearby town of Oakhaven during that summer. Elias Thorne reported that he had started hearing a low humming sound coming from the ventilation shafts of the secret underground station. He believed that something was moving through the limestone tunnels and was using the highway pull-off to monitor the traffic on the surface. The humming was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass lenses of his glasses to vibrate and eventually crack in his hands. Silas read closely as the logbook captured the description of rhythmic thumping against the exterior concrete walls of the hidden mountain bunker. Elias stopped writing for several hours, and the next entry was a frantic scrawl that was barely legible to the human eye. The technician whispered through his writing that he could see shadows moving through the reinforced glass of the observation port in the door. He claimed that the visitors were not from any government agency, and they did not look like any human beings he had ever encountered. The thumping was persistent and moved from the floors up to the heavy steel ceiling of the room with a terrifying speed. The investigation into the disappearance of Elias Thorne had originally concluded that he likely suffered from a mental breakdown and walked into the woods. However, the details in the logbook suggested that the technician was documenting a very specific and physical threat to his life and safety. Silas paused his reading and looked at the date on the final page, which was the night before Elias went missing from his post. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the description of the thumping in the logbook matched the vibration he felt. The sound was sharp and sounded like heavy stones striking against the reinforced concrete frame of the isolated highway station. The final few paragraphs of the logbook contained a frantic description of the bunker being filled with a bright and blinding green light. Elias shouted through his pen that the humming sound was vibrating his teeth and making his eyes lose focus from the sheer pressure. He mentioned that he was going to bolt the inner chamber and hope that the mountain would protect him from the entities outside. The writing ended abruptly with a long ink smear across the page and the sound of a heavy metallic crash recorded in his memory. Silence filled the office of Silas as he closed the book and looked out at the dark and empty highway in the distance. Silas contacted the State Historical Department the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the abandoned highway pull-off site. A researcher named Marcus Reed examined the logbook and confirmed that the ink and paper matched the official government supplies of 1972. They returned to the site of the bunker together to look for the inner chamber Elias mentioned in the final pages of his log. The woods seemed different under the gray morning light, but the feeling of being watched by something unseen remained heavy on their minds. They found a small metal door buried behind a stack of rusted supply crates that contained a series of blueprints and a gold watch. The blueprints showed detailed diagrams of a tunnel system that extended several miles beneath the highway and into the center of the mountain. One image captured a large circular chamber that was not part of the original engineering plans for the highway pull-off or the bunker. Marcus noted that the gold watch had stopped at the exact moment the final log entry was written during that night in August. They realized that Elias Thorne had not simply walked away, but had been pulled into a world that existed far below the surface. The hands on the watch began to spin backward rapidly when the men brought it near the electronic sensors of their equipment. The authorities sealed the entrance to the pull-off with a thick layer of reinforced concrete to prevent any further trespassing or investigation by the public. Silas often thinks about the quiet technician and the man who spent his final hours recording a warning for anyone who found the bunker. The logbook serves as a haunting reminder that some secrets are buried beneath the highway for a very specific and dark reason. He no longer works on mountain infrastructure projects because the low humming sound still echoes in his ears whenever he is alone at night. The pull-off remains empty and forgotten by the thousands of drivers who pass over the secret every single day. Every time Silas drives past that specific mile marker on the highway, he remembers the frantic handwriting of the lost government technician named Elias. He kept a photocopy of the logbook in a secure file, but he rarely has the courage to look at the final ink smear. The researcher, Marcus Reed, resigned from his position shortly after the investigation ended, and he never spoke of the gold watch or the tunnels. Local legends continue to grow about the unmarked pull-off and the green lights that still appear in the woods during the summer. Silas knows that the truth is buried deep in the limestone bedrock where the vibrations never truly stopped moving through the earth. This roadside camera captured something nobody noticed. The long and winding stretch of asphalt known as Route 42 cut a lonely path through the dense pine forests of the Pacific Northwest. For miles in every direction, the landscape was dominated by ancient cedar trees and thick undergrowth that swallowed the morning light. A single automated traffic camera sat perched atop a weathered steel pole near the remote boundary of a massive state park. This specific device was programmed to take a high-resolution photograph every 60 seconds to monitor seasonal weather and road conditions. Local transportation officials rarely checked the digital archives unless a significant accident or a major storm was reported in the area. On a Tuesday in October of 2021, the camera recorded a sequence of images that seemed entirely ordinary to any casual observer. Silas Thorne was a 34-year-old maintenance technician who worked for the Regional Department of Transportation during that year. His primary job involved traveling to remote locations to ensure that solar panels and data transmitters were functioning within normal parameters. Silas enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the rugged landscape far from the city noise. He was a man of habit who took pride in the technical precision required to keep the remote monitoring network alive. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific camera unit was experiencing a strange, recurring storage error. He packed his tools into his white utility truck and began the long drive toward the isolated mountain pass corridor. The drive took nearly 3 hours as the elevation climbed and the fog hung low over the dense canopy of trees. Silas reached the base of the pole and connected his rugged laptop to the diagnostic port located inside the metal box. He noticed that the hard drive was almost full of temporary files that should have been deleted automatically every month. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of photographs taken during a recent heavy rainstorm. Silas decided to download the final batch of images before he cleared the memory and reset the internal software. He wanted to make sure the optical sensor had not been damaged by the moisture or the high winds. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the thumbnails to ensure the lens was still properly focused. He saw the familiar gray pavement and the blurred shapes of passing cars that moved through the frame at high speeds. One image from 3 nights prior caught his eye because the background lighting looked different from the photos around it. A small white sedan was parked on the narrow shoulder of the road just past the edge of the guardrail. The car had its hazard lights on, and the driver's side door was left standing wide open toward the forest. It was an odd place to stop because the terrain was steep and there were no trails in sight. Silas felt a slight chill because that section of the highway was known for having absolutely no cellular phone service. He clicked on the next photo in the sequence to see if the driver was standing near the vehicle for help. The white sedan was still there, but the open door was now closed and a dark figure stood near the trunk. The figure appeared to be reaching into the dense brush, and they were pulling something heavy out from the shadows. Silas zoomed in on the grainy pixels until he could see the silhouette of a large and dusty camping trunk. The person in the photo was wearing a dark hooded jacket that obscured their face from the camera lens. He checked the timestamps and realized that the person had been at that specific location for less than 4 minutes. The third photo showed the white sedan pulling back onto the asphalt and leaving nothing but tire tracks in the mud. Silas looked toward the actual spot on the shoulder and saw that the grass was still flattened near the trees. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished. He stepped over the metal guardrail and walked toward the exact place where the figure had stood in the photograph. The air was cold, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the high branches of the pines. The ground was soft from the recent rains, and he noticed deep gouges in the earth where something had been dragged. He followed the trail for about 50 feet until he reached a small clearing hidden behind a thicket of ferns. Silas found the camping trunk tucked under a pile of damp pine needles and heavy branches that looked intentionally placed. He reached down to touch the cold plastic surface and saw that the heavy latches were sealed with industrial tape. A faint smell of metallic decay hung in the stagnant air, and Silas immediately pulled his hand back in realization. He knew that he should not open the container without the proper authorities present at the scene. He used his radio to contact the dispatch office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious item in the woods. Within an hour, 2 state troopers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with yellow plastic tape. They asked Silas to show them the photographs on his laptop so they could identify the make and the model. The officers noted that the white sedan did not have a visible rear license plate in any frame. They carefully cut the tape on the trunk and discovered several stolen historical artifacts from a local museum storage facility. These were items that had been missing for months following a sophisticated heist that left no physical evidence behind. The museum had reported a quiet break-in 3 months earlier, but the investigators had no leads on the items. These artifacts were extremely valuable, and the thieves had likely hidden them in the forest until the heat died down. The police realized the driver must have returned to the woods to move the cache to a more permanent location. They analyzed the road camera data from other units along the highway to track the path of the white sedan. This lead eventually took them to a small rental property located 2 towns over from the edge of the park. They found the vehicle hidden in a detached garage behind a row of tall hedges and overgrown weeds. Inside the house, the authorities found more items that had been taken during the same heist earlier that same year. The suspects had been living there under false names while they waited for a buyer to finalize a secret purchase. One of the men was a former security guard who knew exactly how to avoid the primary surveillance systems. He did not realize that the remote traffic camera was set to trigger every minute regardless of any motion. His simple mistake of parking in that specific spot had provided the only evidence needed to solve the case. The archives of the transportation department had captured the one moment he thought was completely private. Silas returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details. Most people would have deleted the corrupted files without looking at the images because it was a routine maintenance job. The state park was now safe from the looters, and the historical treasures were returned to their rightful display cases. He continued his work across the mountains and always looked a little closer at the photos from the lonely road. Sometimes, the most important things are hidden in the background of a world that is always moving fast. The quiet technician had become an accidental hero by simply doing his job with a watchful eye. The automated camera still stands on its steel pole and records the passage of time 1 frame at a time. It captures the fog and the trees and the occasional car that travels through the silence of the woods. No one ever suspects that a simple machine could be the most important witness to a crime in the wilderness. Silas knows that every photograph tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to look. He drives the highway with a new perspective and watches the shadows for anything else the lens might catch. The forest remains vast and mysterious, but it is no longer a place where secrets can stay hidden forever. The strange events linked to a winter motel. The isolated stretch of highway leading toward the northern peaks remained a silent witness to the brutal winters of the territory. A single automated security camera sat perched atop a weathered steel pole near the remote boundary of a roadside motel. This specific device was programmed to take a high-resolution photograph every 60 seconds to monitor the vacant parking area. Local law enforcement rarely checked the digital archives unless a significant incident or a missing traveler was reported in the area. On a Tuesday in January of 2022, the camera recorded a sequence of images that seemed entirely ordinary. Silas Thorne was a 42-year-old maintenance technician who worked for the Regional Department of Transportation during that year. His primary job involved traveling to remote locations to ensure that solar panels and data transmitters were functioning within parameters. Silas enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the rugged landscape far from the city noise. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific camera unit was experiencing a strange recurring storage error. He packed his tools into his white utility truck and began the long drive toward the isolated mountain pass corridor. The drive took nearly 3 hours, and the fog hung low over the dense canopy of ancient cedar and fir. Silas reached the base of the pole and connected his rugged laptop to the diagnostic port located inside the box. He noticed that the hard drive was almost full of temporary files that should have been deleted automatically every month. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of photographs taken during a recent heavy snow. Silas decided to download the final batch of images before he cleared the memory and reset the internal software. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the thumbnails to ensure the lens was still focused. He saw the familiar gray pavement and the blurred shapes of passing cars that moved through the frame at speeds. One image from 3 nights prior caught his eye because the background lighting looked different from the photos around. A small white sedan was parked on the narrow shoulder of the road just past the edge of the motel. The car had its hazard lights on, and the driver's side door was left standing wide open toward the forest. Silas felt a slight chill because that section of the highway was known for having absolutely no cellular phone service. He clicked on the next photo in the sequence to see if the driver was standing near the vehicle alone. The white sedan was still there, but the open door was now closed, and a dark figure stood near the trunk. The figure appeared to be reaching into the dense brush, and it was pulling something heavy out from the shadows. Silas zoomed in on the grainy pixels until he could see the silhouette of a large and dusty camping trunk. He checked the timestamps and realized that the person had been at that specific location for less than 5 minutes. The third photo showed the white sedan pulling back onto the asphalt and leaving nothing but tire tracks in the mud. Silas looked toward the actual spot on the shoulder and saw that the grass was still flattened near the trees. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished. He stepped over the metal guardrail and walked toward the exact place where the figure had stood in the photograph. The ground was soft from the recent rains, and he noticed deep gouges in the earth where something was dragged. He followed the trail for about 50 feet until he reached a small clearing hidden behind a thicket of ferns. Silas found the camping trunk tucked under a pile of damp pine needles and heavy branches that looked intentionally placed. He reached down to touch the cold plastic surface and saw that the heavy latches were sealed with tape. A faint smell of metallic decay hung in the stagnant air, and Silas immediately pulled his hand back in realization. He used his radio to contact the dispatch office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious item in woods. Within an hour, 2 state troopers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with yellow plastic tape. They asked Silas to show them the photographs on his laptop so they could identify the time and the place. The officers noted that the white sedan did not have a visible rear license plate in any of the frames. They carefully cut the tape on the trunk and discovered several stolen historical artifacts from a local museum storage facility. The museum had reported a quiet break-in 3 months earlier, but the investigators had no leads on the items. These artifacts were extremely valuable, and the thieves had likely hidden them in the forest until the heat died. The police realized the driver must have returned to the woods to move the cache to a more permanent location. They analyzed the road camera data from other units along the highway to track the path of the car. This lead eventually took them to a small rental property located 2 towns over from the edge of the park. Inside the house, the authorities found more items that had been taken during the same heist earlier that same year. The suspects had been living there under false names while they waited for a buyer to finalize a secret sale. One of the men was a former security guard who knew exactly how to avoid the primary surveillance systems. He did not realize that the remote traffic camera was set to trigger every minute regardless of any motion. His simple mistake of parking in that specific spot had provided the only evidence needed to solve the entire case. Silas returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details. Most people would have deleted the corrupted files without looking at the images because it was a routine maintenance job. The winter motel was now clear of the mystery, and the historical treasures were returned to their rightful cases. He continued his work across the mountains and always looked a little closer at the photos from the lonely road. Sometimes the most important things are hidden in the background of a world that is always moving too fast. The automated camera still stands on its steel pole and records the passage of time 1 frame at a time. It captures the fog and the trees and the occasional car that travels through the silence of the deep woods. No one ever suspects that a simple machine could be the most important witness to a crime in the wilderness. Silas knows that every photograph tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to look. He drives the highway with a new perspective and watches the shadows for anything else the lens might catch. Final footage from the camera reportedly showed that the suspects had used the motel as a temporary landmark for their activities. Witness statements gathered later mentioned a white sedan frequenting the area during the hours after midnight when the highway was empty. Dispatch logs confirmed that no service calls had been placed from that vicinity for over 48 hours before the find. The investigation concluded that the thieves had intended to smuggle the artifacts across the northern border by the end of winter. This case remains a prominent example of how routine data maintenance can expose secrets hidden in plain sight for years. The recovered items were documented in archived calls between the museum and the Regional Recovery Task Force as being priceless. Silas often thinks about the moment the progress bar reached 100% and the thumbnail first appeared on his screen. The cold air of the mountain pass still carries the memory of that day when a machine captured the truth. He continues to maintain the network of cameras with a diligence that ensures no detail is ever truly lost. The forest remains quiet now, but the record of the winter motel is preserved in the Regional Safety Archives. The story of the stolen artifacts serves as a reminder of the historical significance buried within the small mountain towns. Students now visit the museum to see the displays that were nearly lost to the black market forever. The regional board implemented new protocols to review all storage errors manually to prevent similar incidents from going unnoticed. Silas is often cited in training sessions as the primary example of a technician who performed his duty with excellence. The highway continues to wind through the pines, and the camera continues to click in the silence of the night. Every minute, a new frame is added to the digital history of the Northern Corridor for the safety of all. The record of the world grows steadily as the machines watch over the lonely places where humans rarely venture alone. Silas knows that the truth is always there, waiting to be found by someone with the patience to look closely. The mystery of the winter motel is solved, but the watch over the mountain highway will never truly come to an end. The silence of the pines is now filled with the knowledge that the past is finally safe and secure. The warning, hidden in a camper's last dashcam footage. The presence of a dashcam often provides the only objective record of what occurs when a person disappears into the wilderness alone. In many cases of missing hikers and campers, the final frames of footage contain subtle details that authorities originally missed during the initial search. A small silver vehicle was found abandoned at the end of a Forest Service road in the spring of 2022. Inside the car, a dashboard camera was still plugged into the power port, despite the battery of the vehicle being completely dead. Lyle Hendricks was a 48-year-old freelance photographer who specialized in capturing rare nocturnal wildlife in the high desert. He arrived at the remote canyon entrance on a Friday afternoon with the simple goal of setting up his motion cameras. The weather was unusually warm for that time of year, and Lyle expected to stay at his campsite for at least 3 nights. He carried a professional-grade camera bag and enough water to last for several days in the dry heat of the canyon. The landscape was rugged and filled with deep sandstone cracks that could easily hide a man from the view of a helicopter. As Lyle drove his truck along the narrow dirt path, he noticed a series of strange markings painted on the rocks. He followed the winding road until he reached a flat clearing where the trail ended abruptly at the edge of a cliff. The dashcam recorded him parking the vehicle and stepping out to inspect the area before the sun began to set. Lyle looked toward the horizon and seemed to be tracking something moving quickly through the brush near the base of the cliffs. He returned to the truck and checked his GPS unit before realizing that the signal was fluctuating wildly for no reason. He sat in the driver's seat and the dashcam captured a strange humming sound that seemed to be coming from the ground. A thick layer of dust began to swirl around the hood of the car, even though there was no wind that day. Lyle reached for his radio to call the park dispatch office, but only static came through the small speakers of the unit. He found a piece of notebook paper and wrote a quick note about a light he saw reflecting off the canyon walls. The handwriting on the note was shaky and suggested that Lyle was feeling a sudden sense of physical disorientation or fear. According to local archives, the area where Lyle parked had been the site of several unexplained disappearances since 1975. Dispatch logs from that decade indicate that multiple campers reported seeing figures that moved without making any sound at all. Search teams arrived at the clearing 4 days after Lyle was reported missing, but found no signs of a struggle or injury. They found his camera equipment sitting on the ground, but the memory cards had been removed from every single device in his bag. Lyle picked up his dashcam and realized it was the only piece of hardware that still had a recorded file on it. The photographer had decided to keep the dashcam running through the night to capture any movement in front of his truck headlights. He spent the last few minutes of his recorded life staring into the darkness while the internal microphone picked up a rhythmic clicking. Lyle felt a strange sense of curiosity and stepped out of the vehicle one last time to investigate the source of the noise. He walked toward the edge of the clearing and disappeared from the frame of the dashcam as the clicking sound grew louder. The town was quiet when the investigators finally played the footage back at the local police station several weeks later. The authorities eventually found a working monitor and watched the final 30 minutes of the dashcam file with the volume turned up. He pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of electronic interference, followed by the sound of a metal door latch. A voice that sounded distant and distorted began to overlap with the audio of the wind blowing through the canyon floor. The figure on the screen moved with a fluid motion that did not match the gait of any hiker they had seen. He spoke with a level of urgency that suggested he was trying to warn someone about a danger approaching from the hills. The footage described how a large shadow would move across the ground even when the moon was hidden behind the thick clouds. Witness statements from 2022 mentioned similar shadows being seen by a group of geologists working in the same sector. Lyle Hendricks reported that he had started feeling a heavy pressure in his chest as the clicking sound moved closer to his car. He believed that something was projecting a frequency that was intended to keep him from leaving the clearing that night. The pressure was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass of the windshield to develop a network of fine cracks. The investigators listened closely as the recording captured the sound of heavy scratching against the undercarriage of the abandoned truck. Lyle stopped moving for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the rapid clicking of a strange biological mechanism. The camper whispered that he could see a tall shape standing just beyond the reach of the high beam lights of the truck. He claimed that the visitors were waiting for the battery to die so the clearing would be in total darkness. The scratching was persistent and moved from the tires up to the roof of the vehicle with incredible mechanical precision. The investigation into the disappearance of Lyle Hendricks had originally concluded that he likely fell into a deep canyon crevice while hiking. However, the details on the dashcam suggested that the camper was being actively hunted by something that understood how his technology worked. The sheriff paused the video and looked at the timestamp, which showed that the camera stopped recording at exactly 3 in the morning. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the clicking on the recording matched the heartbeat of a person. The sound was sharp and sounded like bone striking against the metal frame of the heavy silver truck. The final few seconds of the video contained a frantic glimpse of a hand reaching toward the lens from the outside. Lyle shouted that the light in the sky was getting larger and was drawing the oxygen out of the surrounding air. He mentioned that he was going to try and run toward the cave system he had photographed earlier that same day. The recording ended abruptly with a bright flash of white light and the sound of the car alarm being triggered. Silence filled the room of the station as the screen turned black, without any more images of the canyon or Lyle. The sheriff contacted the Forest Service the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the internal storage of the camera. A technician named Silas Vance examined the digital files and confirmed that the footage had not been tampered with or edited. They returned to the site of the clearing together to look for the cave system Lyle mentioned in his final words. The desert seemed empty under the afternoon sun, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their tired minds. They found a small metal box buried in the sand that contained a series of sketches and a broken lens. The sketches showed detailed drawings of a craft that looked like a polished stone floating just above the jagged canyon floor. One image captured a figure standing in the doorway of a cave with glowing patterns etched into its gray, translucent skin. Silas noted that the broken lens had a residue on it that glowed when exposed to an ultraviolet light source. They realized that Lyle Hendricks had not simply wandered off, but had been documenting a presence that has been here since 1900. The patterns on the sketches seemed to shift when the men looked at them from a different angle in the light. The authorities closed the case officially, but the dashcam footage remains in a high-security evidence locker at the county office. The family of Lyle Hendricks often thinks about the quiet photographer and the warning he tried to leave behind for others. The video serves as a haunting reminder that the desert holds secrets that are better left undisturbed by those who carry cameras. He no longer explores the high desert because the clicking sound still echoes in the back of his mind at night. The clearing remains empty and avoided by locals, but the dashcam still holds the final warning of 2022. An archived voicemail investigators still study. The silent servers of the regional telecommunications hub in the coastal city of Blackwood Bay remained a quiet witness to the digital age. A single automated backup drive sat perched atop a weathered metal rack inside the remote boundary of a busy industrial park. This specific device was programmed to record all redirected emergency voicemails every 60 seconds to monitor service reliability and potential network failures. Local communications officials rarely checked the digital archives unless a significant outage or a major system crash was reported in the area. On a Tuesday, in October of 2022, the recorder captured a sequence of audio data that seemed entirely ordinary. Silas Thorne was a 44-year-old senior systems technician who worked for the regional utility department during that busy year. His primary job involved traveling to remote locations to ensure that backup power units and data transmitters were functioning within normal parameters. Silas enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the rugged landscape far from the crowded city noise. He was a man of meticulous detail who could spot a signal interference pattern in 1,000 lines of raw code. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific server unit was experiencing a strange recurring storage error. He packed his tools into his white utility truck and began the long drive toward the isolated signal tower near the coast. The drive took nearly 3 hours, and the fog hung low over the dense canopy of ancient cedar and fir trees. Silas reached the base of the tower and connected his rugged laptop to the diagnostic port located inside the metal box. He noticed that the hard drive was almost full of temporary files that should have been deleted automatically every 30 days. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of voice recordings taken during a recent heavy rainstorm. Silas decided to download the final batch of audio files before he cleared the memory and reset the internal software of the server. He wanted to make sure the digital sensor had not been damaged by the high humidity or the coastal salt air. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the audio waves to ensure the recordings were still properly indexed. He saw the familiar blue lines and the blurred shapes of passing data packets that moved through the system at high speeds. One recording from 3 nights prior caught his ear because the background static sounded different from the audio files around it. A single voicemail was placed from a narrow shoulder of the highway just past the edge of the rocky cliffs. The caller had their voice low, and the message was left standing wide open toward the dark and crashing ocean waves. It was an odd place to call because that specific section of the road was known for having absolutely no cellular service. Silas felt a slight chill because the caller reportedly sounded calm despite the absolute silence of the surrounding environment during the midnight hours. He clicked on the next file in the sequence to see if the person was speaking to a dispatcher for emergency help. The audio log was still there, but the verbal report was now silenced and a dark hum stood near the end. The signal appeared to be reaching into the dense brush, and it was pulling something heavy out from the digital shadows. Silas zoomed in on the grainy audio until he could see the silhouette of a large and repeating electronic pulse. The data on his screen was describing a rhythmic movement that matched the pace of a slow and steady physical breath. He checked the timestamps and realized that the call had been at that specific location for less than 5 minutes total. The third recording showed the signal strength pulling back to 0 and leaving nothing but tire tracks in the audio file. Silas looked toward the actual spot on the map and saw that the ground was entirely undeveloped near the pine trees. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished. He stepped into his truck and drove toward the exact place where the signal had pointed in the archived radio log. The air was cold, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the high branches of the trees. The ground was soft from the recent rains, and he noticed deep gouges in the earth where something heavy had been dragged. He followed the trail for about 50 feet until he reached a small clearing hidden behind a thicket of overgrown ferns. Silas found a heavy metal storage trunk tucked under a pile of damp pine needles and branches that looked intentionally placed. He reached down to touch the cold plastic surface and saw that the heavy latches were sealed with industrial duct tape. A faint smell of metallic decay hung in the stagnant air, and Silas immediately pulled his hand back in sudden realization. He knew that he should not open the container without the proper law enforcement authorities present at the remote scene. He used his mobile radio to contact the dispatch office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious item in the woods. Within an hour, 2 state troopers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with yellow plastic tape. They asked Silas to show them the audio logs on his laptop so they could identify the tone and the pitch. The officers noted that the caller did not have a registered phone number in any of the captured maritime records. They carefully cut the tape on the trunk and discovered several stolen historical artifacts from a local museum storage facility. These were items that had been missing for months following a quiet break-in that left no physical evidence behind. The museum had reported a quiet break-in 3 months earlier, but the investigators had no leads on the missing items. These artifacts were extremely valuable, and the thieves had likely hidden them in the forest until the search died down. The police realized the caller must have returned to the woods to move the cache to a more permanent location. They analyzed the signal logs from other towers along the coast to track the path of the unknown vehicle. This lead eventually took them to a small rental property located 2 towns over from the edge of the park. They found the suspect living in a detached garage behind a row of tall hedges and old weeds. Inside the house, the authorities found more items that had been taken during the same period earlier that same year. The suspect had been living there under a false name while he waited for a buyer to finalize a secret purchase. One of the men was a former security guard who knew exactly how to avoid the primary surveillance monitoring systems. He did not realize that the remote signal tower was set to record every frequency, regardless of any active transmission. His simple mistake of making a call in that specific spot had provided the only evidence needed to solve the case. The archives of the utility department had captured the one moment he thought was completely private in the dark. Silas returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details. Most people would have deleted the corrupted files without listening to the audio because it was a routine maintenance job. The historical records were now safe from the looters, and the original artifacts were returned to their rightful display cases. He continued his work across the mountains and always looked a little closer at the logs from the lonely signal towers. Sometimes the most important things are hidden in the background noise of a world that is always moving too fast. The quiet technician had become an accidental hero by simply doing his job with a very watchful ear. The automated recorder still sits in its metal box and records the passage of time one file at a time. It captures the wind and the trees and the occasional signal that travels through the silence of the deep woods. No one ever suspects that a simple machine could be the most important witness to a crime in the wilderness. Silas knows that every audio log tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to listen. He drives the coast with a new perspective and watches the signal meters for anything else the antenna might catch. The forest remains vast and mysterious, but it is no longer a place where secrets can stay hidden forever. The federal investigation revealed that the suspects had intended to sell the items on the black market to private collectors. This operation would have stripped the town of its legal history and compromised the integrity of the local museum archives. The recovery of the original artifacts ensured that several ongoing historical research projects could be settled with accurate evidence. Silas received a formal commendation from the regional board for his role in preserving the heritage of the entire coastal community. He often shares the story of the archived voicemail with new technicians as a lesson in professional diligence and care. The signal logs are now fully digitized, but the physical history remains protected by the sensors and the heavy forest. The quiet tower stands on the hill and continues to serve the residents, as it has for many years. Visitors drive past the industrial park without knowing the secret that was hidden deep beneath the canopy of the trees. The story of the digital recorder and the metal trunk has become a local legend among the city residents. Most people walk past the signal tower without realizing its significance in the history of the regional maritime safety. For Silas, the sound of the wind against the antenna will always be a reminder of the hidden truths. The record of the world continues to grow one frame at a time. For anyone who cares to look, the truth about what happened on that Tuesday in October remains locked away in boxes of redacted paperwork and files. The people of Blackwood Bay continue their lives while the mystery of the archived voicemail hangs over the coast. It is a reminder that some things are captured by the machines that are never meant to be understood by humans. Silas continues to keep his watch from a distance, knowing that the sensors will eventually trigger another silent alarm. The silence of the forest is never truly empty when the sensors are the only ones left to listen. The story of the call is written in the data and preserved in the digital logs. What happened in this roadside motel was never reported. Local police files from 1996 contain a series of strange reports about a motel on Highway 8. Most of these official documents were never released to the public because the findings were considered too strange for print. Lyle Thorne was a 42-year-old insurance investigator who specialized in finding high-value missing property. He spent most of his life driving through rural counties and staying in places that most people would usually avoid. One rainy Tuesday in October, he was looking for a place to rest after a long day of tedious work. The Sunnyside Inn sat on a quiet stretch of road that felt far away from any major town or city. Lyle pulled his sedan into the gravel lot and noticed that the neon sign was flickering in the dark woods. There were only two other cars parked in front of the long row of identical blue doors near the office. He checked into room 14 and paid the elderly man at the desk with $20 in crisp cash. The room smelled like old cedar and industrial cleaner, which was common for these types of cheap roadside lodging houses. Lyle set his briefcase on the desk and decided to record his daily notes before he went to sleep tonight. He turned on his portable tape recorder and started describing the mundane details of his latest insurance claim in the city. A sharp, metallic scratching sound coming from behind the wall made him stop talking in the middle of a sentence. He looked at the thin floral wallpaper and realized the sound was moving slowly from the ceiling toward the floor. Lyle walked over to the wall and pressed his ear against the cold surface to hear what was happening inside. He heard a soft, rhythmic thumping that sounded like a heavy heart beating against the wooden frame of the building. The investigator decided to walk outside to see if there was any maintenance work being done on the exterior wall. The gravel lot was completely empty, and the two cars he saw earlier were now gone without making any sound. He looked at the window of room 15 next door, but the heavy curtains were shut tight against the night. Lyle walked back into his room and noticed that his tape recorder was still running on the small wooden desk. He picked up the device and rewound the tape to see if the scratching sound had been caught on audio. When he pressed play, he did not hear his own voice or the scratching sounds from the thin motel walls. Instead, he heard a recording of a man and a woman having a very quiet conversation about a hidden basement. The voices on the tape sounded like they were standing right next to the microphone in the empty motel room. Lyle checked the recorder for any signs of tampering, but the device was exactly where he had left it earlier. He knew that his recorder had not been out of his sight since he entered the Sunnyside Inn that evening. The woman on the tape mentioned that the floorboards in room 14 were the only way to reach the stairs. Lyle looked down at the stained brown carpet and felt a chill go down his spine in the quiet room. He moved the heavy desk aside and peeled back a corner of the carpet to see what was underneath it. There was a small brass ring attached to a square piece of plywood that had been cut into the floor. He pulled the ring, and the wooden hatch opened with a loud groan that echoed through the small guest room. A narrow set of concrete stairs led down into a dark space that was not visible from the outside. Lyle grabbed his heavy flashlight from his briefcase and began to climb down into the hidden area beneath the motel. The air in the basement was cold and dry, which felt very different from the humid October air outside. He shone his light around the room and saw shelves filled with hundreds of small black boxes and white envelopes. Each box had a date and a room number written on the side in faded black ink from past years. Lyle reached for a box labeled 1984 and found a collection of personal items and Polaroid photos inside. There were driver licenses and wedding rings and small toys that looked like they belonged to families who stayed here. He realized that none of these items were mentioned in any of the local police reports he had ever read. He found a ledger on a nearby table that listed names of guests next to a column titled Final Status. Most of the entries in the ledger ended with the word processed, which made Lyle feel a deep sense of dread. He heard the sound of the blue door to room 14 opening directly above his head in the quiet motel. Lyle turned off his flashlight and crouched behind a stack of wooden crates to stay hidden in the thick darkness. He heard heavy footsteps walking across the floorboards and then the sound of the carpet being pulled back again. A bright beam of light shot down into the basement as the elderly manager peered into the dark square hole. The manager was holding a long iron bar, and he started to climb down the concrete stairs with slow movements. Lyle saw the man stop at the bottom of the stairs and look directly toward the crates where he was hiding. The manager whispered that he knew someone was down there because the ledger had been moved from its original spot. Lyle waited until the man turned his back, and then he bolted for the stairs with every ounce of energy. He scrambled up the concrete steps and pushed past the manager, who tried to grab his leg in the dark. Lyle reached the guest room and ran out the front door into the pouring rain without looking back at all. He jumped into his car and drove toward the nearest town until he found a gas station with bright lights. He called the county sheriff from a payphone and explained that he had found a hidden room at the motel. The sheriff arrived 30 minutes later and followed Lyle back to the Sunnyside Inn to investigate the strange hidden basement. When they arrived at the property, they found that the gravel lot was empty and the neon sign was dark. The office was locked and the manager was nowhere to be found when the sheriff knocked loudly on the door. They entered room 14 and pulled back the brown carpet, but they found nothing but solid subflooring and old nails. There was no brass ring and no wooden hatch and no sign that a hidden basement had ever existed there. The sheriff looked at Lyle with a look of deep suspicion and asked if he had been drinking that night. Lyle pulled the small black box from his jacket pocket to show the officer the evidence he had taken earlier. He opened the box, but instead of jewelry or photos, it was filled with nothing but gray dust and dirt. The sheriff told Lyle to go home and get some rest before he decided to file a false report charge. Lyle drove away, but he kept the tape recorder in the passenger seat as he headed toward the next city. He pressed play on the device to hear the mysterious voices one last time before he reached his own house. The tape was completely silent for several minutes until a new voice started speaking at a very low volume level. It was his own voice, but it was describing the basement and the ledger in the past tense, like history. The recording ended with the sound of a heavy wooden hatch closing and a brass ring hitting the floorboards softly. Lyle looked in his rearview mirror and saw a pair of headlights following him at a very long distance behind. He realized that the things he saw in the motel were never meant to be reported to the local authorities. The Sunnyside Inn was torn down 2 years later to make room for a new highway expansion through the county. Construction crews found nothing unusual in the soil, and no records of a basement were found in the city archives. Lyle Thorne moved to another state and stopped working as an insurance investigator shortly after that strange night in October. He never stayed in a roadside motel again for the rest of his life because he feared the walls. Some stories are better left in the dark where they cannot be proven or recorded by the light of day. The truth about Room 14 remains buried under miles of hot black asphalt and the silence of the deep woods. In this new story, archived winter summaries across several mountain districts mention a cluster of December disappearances that occurred in remote forest corridors during severe cold snaps. None of the cases shared confirmed connections, yet the patterns unsettled investigators because each incident involved travelers who vanished within narrow windows of time and distance. Locals across distant counties traded similar warnings about isolated routes that turned unpredictable once deep winter settled over the landscape. Maeve Corbin, a 35-year-old contract cartographer, drove into one of those regions during early December while updating wildfire access maps before heavy storms closed the mountain roads. Her assignment required photographing trail markers, verifying creek crossings, and checking outdated maintenance routes. She expected a calm day because forecasts predicted only light snow with no major wind. She carried her camera bag, a roll of updated charts, and a small thermos she rarely traveled without. The forest road twisted between steep ridges where the sky looked pale and flat. Patches of ice crept across the asphalt, which forced her to reduce speed. She passed a faded sign warning that plows rarely reached beyond the next junction. A second sign hung loosely along a bent post announcing road closures from mid-month onward. She knew officials planned to block the route soon, but she needed one final survey before seasonal shutdown. After an hour, she reached a narrow turnout where a wooden information board leaned forward as if pushed by years of storms. She stepped out to photograph the area and noticed several footprints leading toward a slope behind the turnout. The prints appeared fresh, which surprised her because no vehicles had passed during her entire drive. She followed the tracks for several yards before they disappeared into a cluster of spruce where snow thickened unexpectedly. Maeve returned to her truck just as wind brushed across the ridge. She climbed back in, warmed her hands near the heater, and drove deeper along the route until she reached a rusted trail gate chained open for winter access. Beyond it, the trees grew denser while the road narrowed. She stopped again when she spotted a small backpack lying upright near a drainage ditch. The sight made her uneasy because the pack looked recently dropped. She examined the backpack carefully. Inside, she found a half-frozen water bottle, an outdated trail map, and a name tag belonging to someone who reportedly passed through the region earlier that week. Local bulletins had mentioned a hiker who turned back during a sudden snow squall, then never returned to town. The match between the name and the story sent a chill through her despite the insulated gloves she wore. She wrote the coordinates in her notebook, then scanned the surrounding woods. Snow fell lightly, which muted the forest until everything felt distant. Wind carried faint creaks from trees shifting under frost. She called out, "Anyone here?" even knowing the chances of hearing a reply were low. Her voice vanished into the branches almost instantly. As she prepared to leave the area, she noticed a strip of reflective tape fixed high on a pine trunk. The tape looked newer than the map in the backpack, which puzzled her because crews rarely mark trees during winter. She photographed the tape, then moved closer to investigate. Behind the trunk, she found a narrow footpath nearly hidden under fresh snow. The path sloped downward toward a shallow ravine. Maeve followed it only briefly because she wanted to finish her official survey before exploring more. She drove another mile until the road opened into a broad meadow where the wind carried powder across the ground in thin streams. The sky darkened earlier than expected, which hinted at an incoming front. She stopped near an old ranger's shed, leaning crookedly against a boulder. The door hung half open as if someone entered recently. Inside, she discovered a battered notebook full of field notes from a ranger patrol several years earlier. The writer described multiple strange findings across the region, including abandoned campsites, missing equipment caches, and faint tracks that vanished mid-trail. One entry mentioned hearing rhythmic knocks in a valley that appeared empty at the time. Another referred to sudden temperature drops in sheltered areas that normally stayed warm due to thick tree coverage. A gust of wind pushed snow into the shed, which made her step outside. She noticed a distant flash of movement between the tree line and the meadow. It looked like someone crossing the clearing quickly. She called out again, but received no answer. She recorded the direction in her notes because the movement matched earlier reports about people seen shortly before storms swept through. She returned to her truck and continued along the route until she reached a steep descent toward a river crossing. The radio crackled with faint static as she drove into the low ground. The river froze early this year, which formed jagged ridges of ice near the bank. She parked near the bridge, which creaked under layers of frost. The scene felt isolated enough to raise her vigilance. She scanned the area and saw a small pile of orange fabric caught in a brush cluster. She approached and found a torn piece of a high-visibility jacket. The fabric pattern matched gear often used by volunteer search teams. She collected the fragment, sealed it in a small evidence pouch, and wrote the discovery in her notebook. A trail of shallow footprints stretched from the fabric toward the riverbank, then curved sharply uphill toward dense vegetation. Maeve followed the trail, which led to an open section of forest where trees grew in uneven clusters. The air felt colder here, even though the wind paused briefly. She heard a faint, repetitive sound that resembled metal shifting. The pattern echoed irregularly, which made her wonder if it came from old equipment hidden somewhere beneath the snow. She swept her flashlight across the branches and noticed more reflective tape placed higher than typical trail markers. She recorded the placements, which formed a rough arc around the clearing. The arrangement looked intentional rather than random. She moved farther into the trees and found a narrow ravine where the snowpack appeared disturbed. Several sets of tracks converged into the ravine, though none continued beyond it. It looked as if multiple individuals descended the ravine, yet never climbed out. She crouched to examine the slope and noticed faint indentations almost hidden beneath the surface. They resembled pressure marks left by equipment pulled along the ground. She brushed away a patch of snow and revealed a rusted metal rung embedded into the soil. The rung looked like part of an old ascent ladder used during past forestry projects. She tugged on it lightly and felt a hollow space beneath. Her pulse quickened as she realized a buried structure might exist under the ravine. Old industrial tunnels or storm shelters sometimes collapsed, then filled with soil and ice. She considered climbing down for a clearer look, but the ground felt unstable. A deep vibration traveled through the slope, which convinced her to back away. The vibration lasted several seconds, then faded like a distant machine shutting down. She returned to her truck and drove toward a higher junction where she could regain radio contact. However, the snow thickened into a white curtain, which limited visibility to a few yards. The approaching storm arrived earlier than predicted, which forced her to stop near a rock outcrop. She checked her maps and found an old maintenance spur branching off the main route. She considered waiting the storm out inside her truck, but the wind intensified until the vehicle rocked gently. She turned onto the spur, hoping to reach a sheltered runoff area. Halfway up the incline, she saw a flickering light near a line of trees. The light pulsed slowly as if signaling through heavy snowfall. She thought it might be a lost hiker or a stranded motorist, so she parked and stepped out with her flashlight raised high. She moved closer and saw the light belonged to a small lantern hanging from a branch. The lantern's flame flickered erratically despite the wind. Beneath it, a message scratched into bark read, "Shelter Line West, Trail 2." She took a picture of the message because the direction did not match any current maps. Before she could investigate further, she heard another vibration behind her. This time, the sound clearly resembled metal scraping across stone. She turned to see a dark outline shift along the ridge, though the storm blurred the details. The shape moved slowly, then vanished behind a curtain of snow. She backed toward her truck, but stopped when she noticed another set of footprints near the lantern. The steps looked fresher than those near the ravine, which meant someone recently walked this route during the worsening storm. Maeve followed the footprints along the spur, which led her to an exposed slope overlooking a deep bowl-shaped corridor. The wind calmed momentarily, which gave her a clear view of the valley floor. She saw multiple patterns carved into the snow, which resembled rows of long trenches or paths created by dragging equipment. At the far end of the bowl, a faint orange glow flickered near the base of a cliff. She zoomed in with her camera and captured several photos. The glow pulsed in a steady sequence, which reminded her of security beacons or signal flares. She lowered the camera as another vibration traveled through the ground. Snow along the slope shifted slightly, which convinced her to retreat before a slide occurred. She drove back toward the main route and reached a narrow ridge where the wind finally eased enough for her to regain partial radio contact. She relayed her findings to a dispatch operator who promised to send search teams when conditions improved. She continued toward the junction when she saw a lone figure standing near a marker post. She slowed her vehicle and opened the window to call out, but the figure turned and walked toward a thicket without responding. She parked and followed on foot with her flashlight directed forward. The figure disappeared behind clusters of fir trees which bent under the weight of snow. She searched the area for several minutes until she found a scrap of fabric caught on a branch. The material matched the torn jacket found near the river, which meant she followed the same person or someone wearing similar gear. She marked the area on her map and returned to her truck as the storm thickened again. By the time she reached town, she felt exhausted from navigating through swirling ice and limited visibility. She handed her notes and photographs to local authorities who launched a coordinated search involving multiple teams. Over the next days, crews uncovered signs of old subterranean structures near the ravine and discovered collapsed ventilation shafts hidden under decades of soil. They found fragments of cold-weather clothing near one shaft, which suggested at least one traveler entered the area recently. Searchers also found pieces of rusted metal aligned in patterns that matched the long trenches Maeve captured in her photos. Engineers believed the structures belonged to a decades-old survey project abandoned after repeated cave-ins and safety violations. Thick snowfall and unstable terrain hid the remains until small shifts exposed parts during recent storms. Despite extensive searches, none of the recent missing individuals were recovered. Their tracks led toward the ravine, then vanished. Officials installed warning signs along the entire route and restricted access to the bowl-shaped corridor where the vibrations continued intermittently throughout the season. Acoustic equipment detected low-frequency pulses beneath the ground, though investigators could not confirm their source. Maeve continued her mapping work for the region but avoided the specific corridor after her report. She believed the December disappearances connected to the unstable subsurface network and shifting snow patterns that revealed and concealed pathways unpredictably. She often thought about the lantern hanging from the tree and the carved message pointing toward a shelter line no longer marked on any map. Locals still warn travelers each December about remote areas with unexplained vibrations and old structures hidden under winter snow. They recount stories about lights flickering near forgotten corridors and figures moving between trees just before storms intensify. Each tale differs slightly, yet the core remains the same. Some December nights, the forest feels alive with echoes of routes built long before current maps existed. And sometimes footsteps lead into valleys where wind and snow erase each trace within minutes, leaving only cold silence across remote America. This photo was recovered after everyone disappeared. The discovery of a high-resolution camera at the bottom of a shallow ravine changed the entire investigation into the missing group. A park ranger found the device while clearing brush near the edge of a popular lookout point in the late autumn. The memory card inside was perfectly preserved despite the harsh weather conditions and the physical damage to the heavy metal casing. It contained a series of photographs that documented the final hours of four experienced hikers who seemed to vanish without trace. Harlan Vance was a 36-year-old commercial pilot who had spent his entire life navigating the rugged coastal ranges. He arrived at the trailhead early on a Friday morning with his three closest friends for a planned weekend mountain trek. The weather was predicted to be clear and cool, but a sudden wall of fog rolled in from the Pacific Ocean. Harlan carried a professional digital camera to document the rare flora and fauna that lived along the high-altitude rocky ridges. The forest was dense, and the air felt damp as the group started their climb toward the summit of the peak. As the group moved higher, they encountered a strange field of scorched grass that formed a perfect circle in the clearing. Harlan stopped to take several photos of the area while his friends checked their compasses, which were spinning in useless circles. They followed the path until they reached a limestone ledge that overlooked a deep valley filled with a thick violet mist. The camera recorded the group looking over the edge with expressions of confusion as they noticed a structure in the trees. Harlan noticed that the shadows on the ground were moving in the opposite direction of the sun during the afternoon hours. He decided to lead the group toward the structure to find shelter as the temperature began to drop below the freezing point. The camera captured a strange shimmer in the air that looked like heat waves rising from the cold and damp ground. A series of photos showed the hikers standing in front of a metallic doorway that was built directly into the cliffside. Harlan took a close-up shot of a control panel that featured symbols that did not match any known human language. He found a small button on the side of the panel, and the doorway opened with a silent and smooth motion. According to local archives, several people had reported seeing strange lights hovering over this specific ridge since the 1950s era. Dispatch logs from the night the group disappeared indicate that multiple residents heard a low-frequency hum coming from the mountain. Search teams arrived at the ledge 3 days later, but they found no signs of the hikers or their heavy packs. They found the camera sitting on a rock, but the tripod had been melted into a puddle of unrecognizable dark glass. Harlan had managed to trigger a burst of photos just as the group entered the dark tunnel behind the metallic door. The investigators downloaded the files and noticed a disturbing pattern in the timestamps of the final 12 images on the card. Each photo was taken exactly 1 second apart, but the position of the stars in the background shifted by several hours. A figure that was not part of the original group appeared in the corner of the frame during the last shot. The person looked like a man wearing a vintage flight suit from the 1940s, but his face was completely blank. He stood with his arms at his sides, while the hikers seemed to be frozen in place by an unseen force. The narrator of the official report described how the camera picked up a bright flash that washed out the entire sensor. Witness statements from a nearby observation post mentioned a beam of blue light that shot into the sky at that time. Harlan Vance was heard on a nearby radio frequency for a few seconds before the signal was cut off by static. He claimed that the room inside the cliff was much larger than the mountain itself and was filled with thousands of lights. The humming was reportedly so intense that it caused the lenses of the binoculars to shatter inside the padded carrying cases. The sheriff listened closely to the audio recovered from a small digital recorder that was also found near the damaged camera. Harlan stopped speaking for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was a rhythmic clicking that sounded like a clock. The pilot whispered that the man in the flight suit was pointing toward a map of the stars on the wall. He claimed that the map was moving and showed the Earth becoming smaller as the group was lifted off the ground. The clicking was persistent and moved from the recorder toward the entrance of the tunnel with a very rapid pace. The investigation into the disappearance of the group originally concluded they were victims of a sudden landslide or a tragic fall. However, the details in the recovered photos suggested that the group had stepped into a place where time did not function. Harlan had documented a physical transition from the mountain trail into a facility that should not have existed on any map. The sheriff paused the slideshow and looked at the final image, which showed a hand reaching for the camera from above. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the hand had 6 long and slender fingers with translucent skin. The final few frames on the memory card contained a distorted image of the valley as seen from a great height. Harlan managed to capture the trailhead where they had parked their car, but the vehicles looked like tiny toys in the distance. He mentioned in the audio that the air felt thin and tasted like ozone and burnt hair as they were moved. The recording ended abruptly with a loud pop and the sound of a vacuum sealing a container shut in the dark. Silence filled the evidence room as the investigators realized that the group was no longer on the mountain or the earth. The authorities contacted a government agency that specialized in unexplained aerial phenomena to examine the metallic door and the control panel. A researcher named Silas Vance arrived at the site but found that the entrance had been replaced by solid and gray limestone. They returned to the ledge with ground-penetrating radar, but the results showed only solid rock for hundreds of feet in every direction. The desert seemed empty under the moonlight, but the feeling of a heavy and cold presence remained in the mountain air. They found a single silver button near the spot where the camera was recovered that felt warm to the touch. The photos showed blurry images of a hangar that contained several craft shaped like polished silver needles resting on the floor. One image captured Harlan looking into a mirror, but his reflection showed a man who was much older, with white hair. Silas noted that the silver button had the same symbols found on the control panel in the earlier photos on the card. They realized that the hikers had not just disappeared, but had been taken to a place where they would never age. The symbols on the button began to glow with a soft blue light when the men spoke the name of Harlan. The case remains open, but the physical evidence is kept in a vault that requires a high level of security clearance. The families of the 4 hikers often visit the trailhead to leave flowers and look at the peaks with a sense of loss. The camera serves as a haunting reminder that some places in the wilderness are not meant to be mapped by human hands. Harlan no longer flies his plane over that section of the range because his instruments always fail when he nears the ledge. The mountain remains a silent witness to the events of that night, while the photos hold the only proof of the truth. Today, no search team members dare to return to the area without full backup communication gear and armed security personnel. Silas Vance spends his nights analyzing the frequency of the hum recorded in the audio to find any hidden messages. He discovered the sound patterns match star transmissions caught by radio telescopes in other parts of the world at the same time. This suggests that whatever happened on that mountain has links to something far beyond our understanding of space and time. The silver button is kept in a lead container because it emits unstable energy that affects all nearby electronic devices. Local residents still report seeing pillars of blue light rising from the peaks whenever fog storms settle in the northern valley. Some believe the hikers are still alive and traveling among the stars on a mission that we cannot yet comprehend. For Silas and the original investigators, the photos are a warning that humans are only guests on this ancient planet. They have decided to destroy the original coordinates of the metal door so that no more lives are lost in vain. The darkness inside the cliff will remain a mystery because the mountain has closed its door with thick layers of rock. Why investigators stopped searching this forest trail? Search and rescue logs from the summer of 1994 contain several redacted entries regarding a popular hiking trail. These official documents mention a series of unexplained events that forced local authorities to permanently close the entire wooded area to the public. Silas Thorne was a 48-year-old forest ranger who spent his career patrolling the rugged northern ridgelines in the park. He was a practical man who understood the dangers of the wilderness and respected the unpredictable nature of the high mountains. Silas lived in a small cabin near the park entrance and kept a detailed journal of every unusual sighting he encountered. One humid morning in August, he received a report about a group of hikers who had vanished near the valley stream. The trail was a well-marked path that thousands of people used every single year without any major safety concerns. He packed his medical kit and checked his topographical maps to plan a search route through the dense green forest. Silas drove his government truck to the trailhead and noticed that the morning birds were unusually quiet in the heavy air. He reported his position to the station and mentioned that a thick fog was starting to settle over the lower valley. A strange metallic humming sound coming from the trees made him pause as he adjusted his heavy nylon backpack straps. He looked toward the thick brush, but the sound was not coming from any mechanical equipment or known service vehicles. Silas continued down the dirt path and noticed that the trail markers had been moved from their original wooden posts. He saw a bright orange ribbon tied to a branch that led deep into a section of the woods labeled off limits. The ranger decided to follow the ribbon to see if the missing hikers had wandered into the dangerous rocky terrain. The forest became incredibly dark as the trees grew closer together, and the sun was blocked by the thick canopy. He looked at his compass and realized the needle was spinning in rapid circles without pointing toward the North Pole. Silas stopped walking and noticed that his heavy boots were leaving deep indentations in the soil that glowed with purple light. The glowing soil started to vibrate as a low-frequency pulse echoed through the floor of the quiet, dark forest. Silas checked his emergency radio for a signal, but the device only produced a series of rhythmic and high clicks. He knew that the local geology was not capable of producing magnetic interference of this specific and intense magnitude. The clicks on the radio stopped, and a voice began to whisper a set of names that sounded familiar to him. Silas grabbed his official logbook and realized the names belonged to people who had gone missing in 1972. He looked at the trees and saw that the bark had been carved with hundreds of small and intricate geometric patterns. The ranger followed the carvings until he reached a clearing where the trees had been pushed by an incredible force. He saw a white tent standing in the center of the clearing that appeared to be brand new and very clean. The tent was unoccupied, but the interior was filled with rows of glass jars that contained different types of soil. Silas stepped inside the tent and saw a small table with a silver tray holding a collection of silver rings. Each ring had a date engraved on the inside that matched the years of the most famous local missing cases. Silas realized that these items were not left behind by hikers, but were being displayed as a specific collection. He found a handheld recorder on the table that was actively capturing the sounds of the forest outside the white tent. Silas pressed the playback button and heard a recording of his own truck arriving at the trailhead recently. The recording included the sound of him speaking into his radio about the thick fog and the quiet birds today. He felt a sharp pain in his chest as a bright flash of light filled the small and white tent. Silas ran out of the tent and scrambled back toward the main trail as the ground began to shake. He reached his truck and drove toward the ranger station without stopping to check for the missing hikers again. Silas told his supervisor about the glowing soil and the silver rings and the strange recordings in the woods. The supervisor looked at the maps and told Silas that the clearing he described did not exist on any survey. A team of 20 investigators returned to the forest trail the following morning to search for any signs of the tent. They found the orange ribbon and the spinning compasses, but the clearing was nothing but a wall of trees. There was no glowing soil and no white tent and no collection of silver rings in the area. The lead investigator looked at Silas and asked if he had been experiencing any symptoms of heat stroke. Silas pulled a single silver ring from his pocket to prove that he had actually been inside the tent. He opened his hand, but the ring had turned into a piece of brittle wood that crumbled into dust. The authorities decided to stop the search and permanently closed the forest trail to protect the public from events. Silas resigned from the Forest Service and moved to a coastal town where there were no trees at all. He kept his original journal, but the pages describing that day were now completely blank and smelled like ozone. He realized that the things he saw in the forest were part of a cycle that repeated often. Silas never went hiking again because he knew that some trails lead to places that do not exist. The forest trail remains closed to this day and is heavily patrolled by private security teams in uniforms. Construction crews tried to pave over the area in 2012, but their heavy machinery failed every time. No records of the missing hikers were ever found in the state archives, and their families stopped asking questions. Silas Thorne lived the rest of his life in silence and never spoke about the glowing purple soil again. Some mysteries are buried so deep in the woods that they are better left for the trees to guard. The truth about why they stopped searching remains hidden under the thick canopy and the silence of the ridge. Silas often wondered if the recordings he heard were being played for someone else who had entered the woods. He knew the forest had its own way of reclaiming the things that people tried to document and report. The strange frequency that he heard on the radio was never detected by any other official equipment in the park. The trail is now overgrown with thorns and heavy brush that makes it nearly impossible for anyone to pass. Local legends say that the birds still go silent whenever the fog begins to roll in from the north. Silas left his journal to the local historical society, but the specific entries about the white tent were gone. Investigators eventually stopped visiting the site after several members of the security team reported hearing voices in the static. The state government removed the trail from all modern maps to ensure that no curious travelers would get lost. The case of the vanishing hikers from 1994 was officially listed as an unsolved wilderness accident. Silas Thorne died knowing that the collection in the white tent was likely still growing with every passing cycle. The woods remain a place where the rules of the world do not always apply to those who enter. His footprints from that day were reported to have faded within minutes of his escape from the clearing. Internal reports suggested that radiation levels in the closed area stayed above normal for several years following the event. Witnesses from nearby towns occasionally report seeing pulsing lights appearing behind the trees when the moon is high. No new investigation has been launched due to fear of what might be rediscovered in the dark of the woods. Silas often sat on the pier of his coastal home, staring at the ocean and wondering about the others. He knew that human memory is a fragile thing that can be easily changed by forces we do not understand. The brown dust from the wooden ring remained in a small jar on his mantle as a silent reminder. Events at the Northern Forest Trail will never be fully reported to avoid mass panic in the general region. Local residents still talk about the disappearances when they gather at the old coffee shop on the edge of town. They know that parts of the mountain do not want to be disturbed by human presence or technology. The secret of 1994 is locked behind the chain-link fence that now surrounds the forest area. Silas Thorne took the secret of the radio whispers to his grave without ever sharing them with anyone. The trees will continue to grow and cover all physical evidence until nothing is left but a fading legend. Whenever the wind blows hard from the north, people remember the last warning written by the forest ranger. Do not follow the orange ribbons that do not lead you back home because the woods have their collection. This story ends as a reminder that the wilderness still holds dark corners that we will never truly master. The purple light Silas saw beneath his feet was perhaps a sign of something older than human history itself. The area is now a dead zone for all modern communication signals, and no satellite can take clear images. The forest has swallowed the past and the future into a single entity that cannot be pierced by logic. Silas Thorne went in peace, but his eyes always turned toward the north as if he were waiting. The mystery of the forest trail will remain part of the darkest secrets of the earth among the trees. The truth the investigators sought was ultimately just a reflection of their own fear of the deep unknown. The popular hiking trail is now just a name in an old document that is yellowing and fading. The silence there is a type of silence that speaks of things that are better left unheard or unseen. New rangers are now given strict instructions to avoid the perimeter fence without asking any medical or operational questions. The path that was once full of families and laughter is now reclaimed by a darkness that refuses to leave. Silas knew that the collection of rings was just a small part of a much larger and darker truth. The world is much stranger than the maps lead us to believe when we walk under the ancient trees. In this new story, archived Winter Patrol summaries describe a remote ski lodge where several visitors reportedly vanished during January storms across multiple decades. Officials never confirmed foul play, which left the lodge classified as a low-priority site despite the strange overlap in dates. Old regional bulletins noted that each disappearance occurred within days of the first heavy snowfall, which created a pattern difficult to ignore. Ronan Kessler, a 36-year-old field technician, received a routine task on a freezing morning when his supervisor asked him to inspect abandoned power lines near that ridge. The request surprised him because the site had not appeared on maintenance schedules for years. He prepared his truck with insulated gear, his weather-worn notebook, and a sturdy radio known to survive interference. The early sky looked pale and washed out, which usually signaled an incoming storm building behind the mountains. He drove up the single-lane access road, which climbed steadily until trees vanished behind blankets of white. Drifts covered the route, which forced him to stop several times to clear ice near the wheel wells. When he reached the last turn, he saw the lodge looming through shifting snow. The structure looked crooked from years of neglect, yet fresh footprints led directly to the warped front door. That detail unsettled him because archives mentioned no active crews assigned to the lodge during winter. Ronan stepped out while the wind whipped icy flakes across the ridge. He approached the entrance slowly since the wooden deck creaked under his boots. A rusted metal sign hung sideways above the door while strands of caution tape fluttered against a railing. The smell of cold pine mixed with a faint chemical scent that reminded him of old industrial labs. He hesitated before pushing open the door, which groaned loudly under layers of ice. Inside, he found a lobby coated in dust and frost. Faded ski posters sagged from the walls, and a collapsed rental counter leaned at an awkward angle. The chemical odor strengthened, which made him breathe shallowly through his scarf. He stood still to listen for movement because abandoned structures often held unexpected hazards. The silence felt oppressive and heavy, like the lodge was absorbing sounds rather than echoing them. A sudden metallic clash rang from a far corridor, which made him tighten his grip on the flashlight. Snow blew through a cracked window, adding a restless whisper to the emptiness. He said quietly, "Hello," while hoping to flush out any squatters. No answer came, which increased his concern. He walked toward the noise with careful steps because uneven floors hid under piles of broken plaster. Halfway down the corridor, he found a steel grate leaning against the wall. Its weight and finish did not match the lodge design, which suggested someone installed it recently. Behind it, he saw a narrow maintenance stairwell missing from old blueprints. He documented the discovery with several photos, then stepped back because the chemical smell grew overwhelming near the stairwell opening. Steam-like condensation rose upward, which felt too warm for an abandoned building in deep winter. Ronan returned to the main corridor and entered a storage room where the door hung crooked on a single hinge. A tripod stood in the center of the room with a camera aimed at a roughly cut hole in the wall. Dust covered everything except the lens, which shone clean in his flashlight beam. The battery compartment sat empty, which suggested deliberate removal. He wrote a quick note in his book about the setup because the arrangement looked designed rather than accidental. A heavy thump sounded from the upper floor, which shook loose frost from exposed rafters. Ronan flinched, then steadied himself before climbing the staircase. The wooden steps bowed under his weight, which forced him to test each board before moving forward. On the landing, he discovered rooms stripped nearly to their frames. One room held several winter jackets arranged neatly along a wall. The jackets looked too new for the lodge and showed no signs of mold, which indicated they had not been here long. He checked a tag that matched a model released only a few years earlier. Near a toppled dresser, he found an emergency service patch tucked between floorboards. The fabric looked clean, which meant someone had dropped it recently. He placed it inside an evidence envelope because the detail felt too important to ignore. Outside the window, he saw the storm intensify until the sky turned white. Snowfall thickened to the point that distant tree lines disappeared. Ronan followed smaller footprints leading toward the lounge where skylight glass had collapsed into hardened ice. The prints cut through drifts before stopping at a kitchen door. He opened it and found a metal table dragged across the floor, leaving long scrape marks. Beneath the table, a wooden hatch stood open, which revealed a stairwell carved into darkness. The chemical smell rushed outward with surprising force, which made him recoil. A faint cough drifted up from the stairwell, which made him freeze. He whispered, "I hear you," and waited. A weak voice answered with a strained plea for help. He descended cautiously because unstable structures could collapse unexpectedly. At the bottom, he found a basement lined with insulation sheets arranged almost like padding. Several portable heaters stood unplugged yet positioned in a deliberate pattern. A pulley system hung overhead with ropes stretched tightly across beams. Behind a crate, he found a woman in her early 20s slumped against the wall with frostbitten fingers and a torn parka. Her voice trembled as she tried to explain what happened. She and a friend entered the lodge 2 days earlier when they were caught in a sudden storm. They heard machinery deeper inside and approached it, believing it might lead to shelter. She remembered stepping on a section of floor that dropped suddenly, which sent her falling into the basement while her friend tried to pull her up. She lost consciousness shortly afterward. Ronan checked her pulse, which felt weak yet steady. He guided her to sit upright against a crate, then searched for signs of the missing friend. Near the pulley system, he found boot impressions similar to the prints upstairs. Scratch marks lined a wooden frame that hid a recessed pressure plate. Someone had tried to pry open the frame using a flat tool. He moved the frame aside with effort, which revealed the plate covered in dust except for a single clean fingerprint. When he pressed the plate lightly, a loud click came from the ceiling, which sounded like a mechanical trigger resetting. He realized the lodge had been altered with a system of hidden traps that responded to pressure changes and weight distribution. The craftsmanship required knowledge beyond casual tinkering. Someone built these modifications intentionally and likely over several winters. A sudden crack from above signaled the hatch beginning to close under its own power. Ronan grabbed the woman and hurried up the stairs as the door slammed shut behind them. The echo vibrated through the corridor, which reminded him of controlled mechanisms, not typical decay. They entered the kitchen where the room groaned under storm pressure. The wind roared through broken vents, which matched the earlier warm draft rising from the stairwell. In the lobby, he noticed the steel grate along the hallway beginning to slide across the floor. The movement looked unnatural because no visible motor powered it. He rushed forward while supporting the woman and jammed a fallen ski pole under the grate, which slowed its closing. They slipped past into the snow as the grate clanged shut behind them with finality. Outside, the storm battered them with bursts of icy wind. Ronan wrapped her in a heavy blanket and secured her in the truck before starting the engine. The wheels spun until they caught traction along the icy path. The descent took hours, while visibility dropped to almost nothing. The constant drum of sleet against the windshield nearly drowned out the woman's occasional murmurs. They reached a ranger station before midnight, where medics treated her for exposure. She offered fragmented details about clicking noises and shifting floors. Investigators interviewed her over several days, though her memory blurred around the moment the floor collapsed. She insisted she heard breathing near the walls during the hours before she fell. When authorities reached the lodge several days later, they found much of the mechanical system dismantled. The pulley framework remained, though the ropes were cut and several gears removed. Inspectors noted inconsistent footprints around the stairwell, suggesting someone visited after Ronan escaped. The jackets in the upper room had vanished, and the tripod camera was gone, along with the clean lens. Ronan accompanied a second team to verify details in his original report. The lodge interior looked different from his earlier visit, which unsettled him. Several rooms had collapsed ceilings that were intact days before. Marks on the floor that once indicated mechanical movement now appeared faint or replaced with scattered debris. Only the pressure plate remained unchanged, though it now sat covered with a fine layer of frost. Later analysis of regional utility files uncovered an unregistered service request from a contractor using a false company name. The request dated back many winters and mentioned delivery of specialized metal components to a site matching the lodge's coordinates. Investigators never traced the contractor despite repeated attempts. During a follow-up search, rangers found an old sled buried under several feet of snow behind the building. The sled carried fragments of rope identical to fibers in the basement pulley system. They also discovered a rusted metal frame with adjustable weights similar to early counterbalance prototypes used in training facilities many decades earlier. Ronan provided additional notes describing temperature shifts he felt inside the lodge, which suggested hidden vents still operated despite no visible power source. Technicians checked for backup generators but found none. They concluded that stored mechanical energy might have powered some of the systems, though no clear explanation emerged. The missing hiker eventually recovered enough to share more details. They remembered hearing rhythmic knocking sounds shortly before becoming separated. They believed the sound came from within the walls, though investigators could not confirm it. The hiker recalled climbing through a tight service gap before blacking out on the ridge, which explained their location when found. Local residents discussed the incident throughout the season. Some believed the lodge served as a clandestine workshop for an unknown engineer fascinated with pressure-triggered traps. Others suspected the place was used as a winter hideout by someone who did not want company. A few claimed older generations whispered about strange noises near that ridge long before the lodge existed. Ronan avoided the site after his final visit because every clue pointed toward deliberate manipulation rather than random decay. The combination of warm drafts, shifting floors, and automated grates suggested a creator who still visited during heavy storms. He often replayed the moment the grate moved by itself, which convinced him the system remained active even after partial dismantling. Authorities secured the area with new barriers and updated warnings. The lodge still stands, buried under January snow. Windows rattle during storms, which gives the building a faint pulse, like a living thing adjusting to winter pressure. Those who approach claim the lodge feels watchful. The basement stairwell remains the most disturbing feature because even sealed doors cannot hide the subtle warmth drifting upward long after all mechanisms supposedly stopped. Ronan believes someone mastered the rhythm of storms and used the lodge to test ideas during the quietest nights. The deeper truth remains locked within those walls, where sound, machinery, and winter silence blend into something quietly waiting for the next January visitor who wanders too close to a place that never fully lets go of its secrets. The final radio check from a remote mountain pass. Search and rescue logs from the winter of 1988 contain a series of confusing entries regarding a high-altitude pass. These internal documents describe a situation where physical evidence simply vanished into the thin air of the northern wilderness. Gideon Vance was a 54-year-old heavy equipment mechanic who spent his summers repairing remote cellular tower generators. He was a man of few words who preferred the isolation of the high country to the noise of the city. Gideon lived in a small cabin on the edge of the national forest and kept his truck in perfect working order. One frigid morning in November, he received a call to check a failing backup battery system at the summit pass. The drive usually took 4 hours through winding dirt roads that were now covered in a thick layer of fresh snow. He packed his heavy tool bag and checked his two-way radio to ensure he could stay in contact with dispatch. Gideon pulled his four-wheel drive truck onto the logging road and noticed the sky was turning a dark shade of charcoal. He reported his departure to the base operator and mentioned that the wind was starting to pick up near the timberline. A loud static burst from his dashboard radio made him reach for the volume knob as he climbed the steep grade. He listened closely, but the sound was not coming from the dispatcher or any other authorized frequency in the mountain range. Gideon pulled over to the side of the road and adjusted the antenna to get a better signal from the valley. He heard a faint, rhythmic tapping that sounded like someone was hitting a metal pipe with a heavy wrench or hammer. The mechanic decided to step outside to see if the noise was coming from his own engine or the nearby trees. The mountain pass was completely silent, except for the sound of his own breathing in the cold and biting mountain air. He looked toward the jagged peaks and noticed that the clouds were swirling in a way that looked almost like smoke. Gideon got back into the warm cab of his truck and realized that his radio was still transmitting a heavy signal. He picked up the microphone and asked if anyone was on the channel, but the only response was the strange tapping. The tapping on the radio changed into a low-frequency hum that made the plastic dashboard of his truck vibrate softly. Gideon checked the battery voltage on his diagnostic equipment, but the readings remained steady despite the strange interference on the air. He knew that his equipment was rated for extreme weather and should not be reacting to a simple mountain winter storm. The hum on the radio stopped abruptly, and a voice began to recite a series of 6-digit geographic coordinates. Gideon grabbed a notepad from the glove box and started writing down the numbers as they were spoken by the voice. He looked at his topographic map and realized the coordinates were pointing to a location exactly 2 miles ahead of him. The mechanic put the truck in gear and slowly drove toward the coordinates while the voice continued to repeat the numbers. He rounded a sharp corner and saw a silver utility van parked in the middle of the narrow and snowy road. The van was covered in a thick layer of frost and appeared to have been sitting in the pass for weeks. Gideon stopped his truck and walked toward the vehicle with a sense of caution that he had developed over many years. He looked through the passenger window and saw that the interior of the van was completely stripped of its original seats. The back of the van was filled with large racks of recording equipment that were glowing with soft green and blue lights. Gideon noticed a heavy black cable running from the van into a deep hole that had been drilled into the rock. He followed the cable to the edge of the cliff and saw that it descended into the dark and foggy canyon. A sudden movement in the driver's seat made him jump back and reach for the heavy flashlight on his work belt. The man in the driver's seat was wearing a thick parka and held a radio microphone in his gloved right hand. Gideon knocked on the glass and asked the man if he needed any help with his vehicle or his radio gear. The man did not move or blink his eyes as he continued to stare straight ahead at the snowy mountain peaks. Gideon opened the door and realized that the figure in the seat was not a person, but a lifelike plastic mannequin. He felt a wave of confusion wash over him as he looked at the intricate wiring connected to the mannequin's head. The recording equipment in the back of the van started to spin, and a high-pitched squeal filled the small space. Gideon reached for the main power switch to stop the noise, but the metal casing was too hot to touch safely. He heard his own voice coming from the speakers in the van describing his departure from the cabin that very morning. The recording was playing back the exact words he had spoken to the dispatcher only 3 hours earlier in the day. He scrambled out of the van and ran back to his truck as the wind began to howl through the pass. Gideon grabbed his radio and tried to call the base station to report the strange vehicle and the automated recording gear. The radio in his truck was dead, and the display screen was cracked as if it had been hit with force. He looked at the silver van and saw that the lights inside were now flashing in a rapid and erratic pattern. Gideon slammed the truck into reverse and backed away from the site until he found a spot wide enough to turn. He drove down the mountain at a dangerous speed and did not stop until he reached the ranger station at the base. The mechanic ran inside and told the duty officer that there was a strange van broadcasting private signals at the summit. The ranger looked at the logs and told Gideon that the road had been closed for 3 days due to ice. The ranger agreed to follow Gideon back up the mountain pass to see the vehicle and the suspicious electronic recording equipment. They drove for an hour through the deepening snow, but they found the road to be completely empty and undisturbed ahead. There were no tire tracks in the fresh powder, and the silver utility van was nowhere to be found near the cliff. Gideon showed the officer the spot where he had parked, but the snow was smooth and white without any marks. They walked to the edge of the cliff, but there was no hole in the rock and no black cable. The ranger told Gideon that the thin air and the cold must have caused him to experience a brief hallucination. Gideon reached into his pocket to find the notepad with the coordinates he had written down during the strange radio event. The paper was in his hand, but the ink had faded into a series of blurry gray smudges that were illegible. He tried to explain that he had heard his own voice on the recording, but the ranger was already walking away. Gideon went home and sat in his quiet cabin while he listened to the silence of the woods outside his window. He turned on his home radio and searched the frequencies until he found the channel he had used that cold morning. There was nothing but the sound of the wind and the faint tapping of a metal pipe against a heavy frame. He realized that the coordinates he had followed were not for a physical location, but for a specific point in time. Gideon never returned to the mountain pass and sold his truck to a local scrapyard a few weeks after that. The cellular company investigated the battery failure at the summit and found that the equipment was in perfect working order. No silver van was ever registered in the county, and no reports of missing mannequins were filed with the state police. The records from that day were filed under miscellaneous interference and were eventually destroyed to make room for new digital files. Gideon Vance lived the rest of his life in the valley and never spoke of the mountain pass to anyone again. Some things that happen in the high country are meant to stay there among the rocks in the freezing winter air. The final radio check from that day remains a mystery that the wilderness has chosen to keep for itself forever.